the Slavs. The more energetically the Slavic proletariat, for its own salvation, must reject not just alliance but even rapprochement with this party. We do not mean with the workers who belong to it but with its organization and particularly its leadership, which is bourgeois through and through. The more closely, likewise for its own salvation, it must join forces with the International Working Men's Association. The German Party of Social Democrats should by no means be confused with the International. The political and patriotic program of the former not only has almost nothing in common with the program of the latter but is even totally opposed to it. True, at the Great Hague Congress the Marxists tried to foist their program on the whole International. This attempt, however, evoked such enormous protest by the delegates from Italy, Spain, part of Switzerland, France, Belgium, Holland, England, and in part the United States that the whole world could see that no one wanted the German program except the Germans themselves. 33 Indeed, there is no doubt that the time will come when the German proletariat itself, having better understood both its own interests, which are inseparable from the interests of the proletariat of all other countries, and the pernicious orientation of this program, which has been imposed on it but by no means created by it, will renounce it and will abandon along with it its bourgeois leaders, its horrors. As for the Slavic proletariat, we reiterate that for the sake of its own liberation from its onerous yoke, it must enter the International. En masse, form factory, artisan, and agrarian sections, and unite them into local federations, and, if it proves necessary, perhaps even into a general Slavic federation. Within the International, which liberates each and everyone from its status fatherland, the Slavic workers can and should meet fraternally with the German workers, without the slightest danger to their independence. Alliance with them on any other basis is absolutely impossible. That is the sole path to the liberation of the Slavs. But the path which the great majority of the West and South Slavic youth are now taking under the leadership of their venerable and more or less time-honored patriots is exactly the opposite. It is exclusively the path of the state, and it is a disastrous one for the masses. Take Turkish Serbia, for example, and specifically the Principality of Serbia, the one spot outside of Russia, except for Montenegro, where the Slavic element has achieved a more or less independent political existence. 34. The Serbian people shed a great deal of blood to liberate themselves from the Turkish yoke. Scarcely had they freed themselves from the Turks, however, and they were harnessed to a new, this time homegrown state called the Principality of Serbia, a yoke which is in fact at least as heavy as that of the Turks. No sooner had this part of the Serbian man received the form, structure, laws, and institutions of a more or less regular state than the people's vitality and vigor, which had ignited the heroic struggle against the Turks and gained ultimate victory over them, seemed suddenly to die away. Granted, they are an uneducated and extremely poor nation, but they are energetic, passionate, and by nature freedom-loving, and all of a sudden they were transformed into a mute and seemingly immobile herd offered up as a sacrifice to bureaucratic plunder and despotism. Turkish Serbia has neither nobility nor very big landowners, neither industrialists nor extremely wealthy merchants. Instead, it has formed a new bureaucratic aristocracy consisting of young people educated, for the most part at state expense, in Odessa, Moscow, Petersburg, Vienna, Germany, Switzerland, and Paris. While they are young and not yet corrupted by state service, these individuals are for the most part distinguished by fervent patriotism, love for the people, a quite sincere liberalism, and lately even adherence to democracy and socialism. As soon as they enter state service, however, the iron logic of their position, the force of circumstances inherent in certain hierarchical and profitable political relationships, makes itself felt, and the young patriots become bureaucrats from head to toe, while continuing, perhaps, to be both patriots and liberals. Everyone knows, though, what a liberal bureaucrat is. He is incomparably worse than a simple and straightforward bureaucratic scourge. The demand of a certain position always proves stronger than sentiments, intentions, or good impulses. When they return home, the young Serbs who have received an education abroad have to become bureaucrats, because of their education, but especially because of their obligations to the government, at whose expense they were for the most part supported while abroad, and also because they have absolutely no other way of earning a living. they have to become members of the bureaucratic class, the sole aristocracy in the country. Once they have joined this class, they become enemies of the people whether they want to or not. It is possible, and highly probable, especially at the outset, that they would like to liberate their people, or at least to improve their condition, but they are obliged to oppress and plunder them. 2 or 3 years in such a situation are enough for them to get used to it and ultimately to reconcile themselves to it, with the help of some liberal or even democratic doctrine near life. Our times are rich in lies of this sort. Once they have reconciled themselves to our necessity, against which it is beyond their power to rebel, they become out and out scoundrels, all the more dangerous to the people the more liberal and democratic their public pronouncements. Then, those among them who are a bit more skillful and a bit more cunning acquire a dominant influence in the microscopic government of the microscopic principality. No sooner have they done so than they begin to peddle themselves to all comers, at home, to the ruling prince or to a pretender to the throne. In Serbia, overthrowing one prince and replacing him with another is called a revolution. Or instead, though sometimes at the same time, to the governments of the protecting powers, Russia, Austria, Turkey, now Germany, which in the East, as everywhere else, has taken France's place, and frequently even to all of them together. One can imagine how free and easy life is for the people in a state like this. And do not forget that Serbia is a constitutional state, where the Skupština elected by the people is in charge of all the laws. Some Serbs console themselves with the thought that this state of affairs is essentially transitory. It represents an unavoidable evil at present but will surely change as soon as the little principality has expanded its frontiers and incorporated all of the Serbian lands, some even say all of the South Slavic lands, and restored the empire of Dushan to its full extent. Then, they say, an era of complete freedom and broad opportunity for the people will begin. Yes, among the Serbs there are people still naive enough to believe this. Indeed, they imagine that when the state expands its frontiers and the number of its subjects doubles, triples, increases tenfold, it will become more of a popular state, and its institutions, the conditions of its existence, and its governmental actions will be less contrary to the people's interests and all of the people's instincts. On what do we base this hope, or supposition? On theory? From a theoretical point of view, however, it seems clear that the more extensive a state, the more complex its structure and the more alien it is to the people. Consequently, the more contrary its interests are to those of the masses, the more overwhelming the oppression it imposes on them, the more impossible it becomes for the people to exercise any control over it, and the more remote the state administration becomes from popular self-government. Or do they base their expectations on the practical experience of other countries? In reply, we need only point to Russia, Austria, expanded Prussia, France, England, Italy, or even the United States, where everything is run by a distinct, entirely bourgeois class of so-called political bosses, or politicians, while the life of the laboring masses is almost as constricted and miserable as it is in monarchical states. Perhaps there are well-educated Serbs capable of objecting that the masses are beside the point. Their task is and always will be to feed, clothe, and in general support with their crude physical labor the flower of their fatherland's civilization, the true representative of the nation. Therefore the educated, more or less propertied and privileged classes alone are relevant. That is precisely where the problem lies. These so-called educated classes, the nobility, the bourgeoisie, which one time really did flower and stand at the forefront of the vital and progressive civilization of Europe, have been rendered deluded and paltry by their obesity and their cowardice. If they represent anything nowadays, it is only the most pernicious and ignoble qualities of human nature. In a country as highly educated as France, we see that these classes were not even capable of defending their country's independence against the Germans. In Germany itself, we see that they are capable only of serving as loyal and faithful lackeys. Finally, let us note that in Turkish Serbia these classes do not even exist. There is only a bureaucratic class. Thus, the Serbian state will crush the Serbian people for the sole purpose of enabling Serbian bureaucrats to live a fatter life. Others, though they despise the existing structure of the Principality of Serbia with all their hearts, tolerated as a necessary means or instrument for liberating those Slavs still subject to the Turkish or even Austrian yoke. At some point, they say, the principality may become the basis and starting point for a general revolt of the Slavs. This is another of those painful illusions that must without fail be dispelled for the Slavs' own good. Those who harbor it are misled by the example of the Kingdom of Piedmont, which is supposed to have liberated and united all of Italy. Italy liberated itself by means of a countless number of heroic sacrifices which it endured for half a century. It owes its political independence mainly to the 40 years of uninterrupted and irrepressible effort by its great citizen Giuseppe Mazzini, who was able, it may be said, to resurrect the youth of Italy and then train it in the perilous but valiant cause of patriotic conspiracy. In 1848, thanks to Mazzini's 20 years of work, when the rebellious people again summoned the entire European world to the festival of revolution, in all the towns of Italy, from the far south to the far north, a handful of bold young men raised the standard of revolt. The whole Italian bourgeoisie followed them. In the Kingdom of Lombardy, Venetia, which was still under Austrian rule, the people rose up en masse and drove the Austrian regiments out of Milan and Venice by themselves, without any military assistance. And what did Royal Piedmont do? What did Victor Emmanuel's father, King Charles Albert, do? The one who, in 1821, when he was still crown prince, handed over to the Austrian and Piedmontese executioners those who had conspired with him for the liberation of Italy. His paramount concern in 1848 was to paralyze the revolution throughout Italy with promises, machinations, and intrigues. He very much wanted to rule Italy, but he hated revolution as much as he feared it. He did in fact paralyze the revolution, the force and momentum of the Italian people, after which it was not difficult for the Austrian forces to deal with his army. His son, Victor Emmanuel, is called the liberator and unifier of the Italian lands. This grossly slanders him. If anyone should be called the liberator of Italy, it is Louis Napoleon, the Emperor of the French. But Italy emancipated itself, and above all it unified itself, despite Victor Emmanuel and against the will of Napoleon III. In 1860, when Garibaldi launched a celebrated expedition to Sicily, just as he was setting out from Genoa, Count Cavour, 35 Victor Emmanuel's minister, warned the Neapolitan government of the impending attack. When Garibaldi liberated Sicily and the entire kingdom of Naples, however, Victor Emmanuel accepted both of them from him, of course, and without very much gratitude. And for 13 years, what has his government done with this unfortunate Italy? He has ravaged it, simply looted it, and now, hated by everyone, his despotism almost makes people regret the expulsion of the Bourbons. That is the way kings and states liberate their co-nationals. No one would find it more useful than the Serbs to learn the actual details of Italy's recent history. One of the methods the Serbian government employs to calm the patriotic fervor of its young people is to make periodic promises to declare war on Turkey next spring, or sometimes in the autumn, when the farm work is done. The young people believe it, they get excited, and every summer and every winter they get ready, after which some unforeseen obstacle, some diplomatic note from one of the protecting powers, always bars the way to the promised declaration of war. It is postponed for 6 months or a year, and in this way the Serbian patriots spend their whole lives in an agonizing and futile wait for a fulfillment that never comes. Not only is the Principality of Serbia in no position to liberate the South Slavs, Serbian or non-Serbian, but with its machinations and intrigues it actually divides and weakens them. The Bulgarians, for example, are prepared to recognize the Serbs as brothers, but they do not want to hear about the Serbian Empire of Dusan. The same goes for the Croats, the Montenegrins, and the Bosnian Serbs. For all these countries the sole deliverance and the sole road to unification is social revolution, not a state war that can have only one outcome, their subjugation either by Russia or by Austria, or, what is more likely, at least initially, their partition between the two. Czech Bohemia, thank heaven, has not yet managed to restore the orb and crown of Wenceslas in all their ancient grandeur and glory. 36 The central government in Vienna treats Bohemia as a mere province, which does not even enjoy the privileges of Galicia, yet there are as many political parties in Bohemia as there are in any Slavic state. Indeed, the accursed German spirit of political intrigue and statism has permeated the education of the Czech youth to such a degree that they run a serious risk of ultimately losing the ability to understand their own people. The Czech peasants represent one of the most splendid Slavic types. Hussite blood flows in their veins, the hot blood of the Toporites, and the memory of Iko lives within them. 37 In our own experience and recollections of 1848, 38 One of the most enviable advantages of the Czech students is their intimate, truly fraternal relationship with them. The Czech urban proletarian is in no way inferior in his energy and fervent devotion to the peasant. He too proved it in 1848. Today, the proletariat and the peasantry love the students and trust in them. But the young Czech patriots should not count too much on that trust. It will necessarily weaken and ultimately disappear if they do not find within themselves a sufficient sense of justice, equality, liberty, and real love for the people to keep in step with them. And the Czech people, the Slavic proletariat of Bohemia, by the word people we always mean particularly the proletariat, is striving naturally and unreluctantly for the same objective as the proletariat of every country, for economic liberation, for social revolution. They would have to be a nation highly unendowed by nature and downtrodden by history, or, to put it bluntly, extremely stupid and inert, to remain alien to this aspiration, which constitutes the sole substantive world issue of our time. The Czech youth do not want to pay their people such a compliment, and even if they did, the people would not deserve it. Indeed, we have incontrovertible evidence of the West Slavic proletariat's keen interest in the social question. In all the Austrian towns where the Slavic and German populations are intermingled, Slavic workers take the most energetic part in all the general declarations of the proletariat. But in these towns hardly any worker associations exist other than those that have accepted the program of the Social Democrats of Germany. In practice, therefore, Slavic workers, drawn by their social revolutionary instinct, are recruited into a party which has the immediate and loudly proclaimed objective of establishing a pan-German state, that is, a vast German prison. It is a very sad fact, but it is a very natural one as well. The Slavic workers are faced with two choices. Attracted by the example of the German workers, their brothers by virtue of social status, common fate, hunger, want, and oppression, they can join a party that promises them a state, a German one, granted, but still a thoroughly popular one, with all sorts of economic advantages to the detriment of the capitalists and property owners and the benefit of the proletariat. Or, attracted by the patriotic propaganda of their venerable and illustrious leaders and their ardent but as yet undiscerning youth, they can join a party in whose ranks and leadership they encounter their everyday exploiters and oppressors, bourgeoisie, factory owners, merchants, financial speculators, Jesuit priests, and feudal lords of vast hereditary or acquired estates. The latter party, however, with much greater consistency than the former, promises them a national prison, a Slavic state, the restoration in all its ancient splendor of the crown of Wenceslas, as though that splendor will make life easier for the Czech workers. If the Slavic workers really had no other alternative than these two, then, admittedly, we would advise them to choose the first. Though mistaken, they would at least share a common fate with their brethren in toil, traditions, and life, whether Germans or non-Germans. In choosing the second, however, they would have to call brethren the direct executioners and bloodsuckers and would be compelled to bind themselves with the heaviest chains in the name of Slavic liberation. In the first instance they would deceive themselves, in the second they would be sold out. There is a third recourse, however, one which will lead directly to deliverance, the formation and alliance of factory and agrarian worker associations on the basis of the International's program. We do not mean, of course, the program propagated under the name of the International by the almost exclusively patriotic and political party of the German Social Democrats, but the one now recognized by all the free federations of the International Working Men's Association, that is, by the workers of Italy, Spain, the Jura, France, Belgium, England, and in part America, and not recognized essentially by the Germans alone. We are convinced that this is the sole alternative, both for the Czechs and for all the other Slavic peoples seeking their complete liberation from oppression of every kind, German or non-German. Everything else is a fraud, bringing honors and bulging pockets to dishonorable and ambitious party leaders, but slavery to the laboring masses. The question that stands before the Czech youth, and the educated Slavic youth in general, is now very clear. Do they want to exploit their own people, to enrich themselves by their labor and achieve their base ambitions on their backs? If they do, they will go along with the old Slavophile parties, with the Polakis, Rikers, Brauners, and Company 39. We hasten to add, however, that among the young adherents of those leaders are many who are blind or deceived, who are not out for anything for themselves but in the hands of adroit individuals serve to ensnare the people. In any event, their role is a highly unenviable one. Those who truly and sincerely want the total emancipation of the masses, however, will come with us along the road of social revolution, for no other leads to the conquest of the people's liberty. Until now, however, the old politics, the narrowest kind of statism, has prevailed in all the West Slavic countries. A German comedy has been performed, but in Czech translation, and not just one comedy but two separate ones, Czech and Polish. Who is unfamiliar with the deplorable history of alternating alliances and ruptures between the statesmen of Bohemia and Galicia, and the series of hilarious statements made by the Czech and Galician deputies in the Austrian Reichsrat, sometimes jointly and sometimes separately. At the bottom of it all is Jesuit feudal intrigue. And by such pitiful and, it may be said, ignoble methods, these gentlemen hope to liberate their compatriots. Strange statesmen. These. And how amused their close neighbor, Prince Bismarck, must be as he observes their political games. Once, however, after the celebrated defeat inflicted on them in Vienna as a result of one of the countless betrayals by their Galician allies, the Czech political triumvirate, Polaki, Riker, and Brunner, decided to stage a bold demonstration. On the occasion of the Slavic Ethnographic Exhibition, which opened in Moscow in 1867 expressly for this purpose, they set out for Moscow with a great number of West and South Slavs in tow to pay homage to the White Tsar, J. the executioner of the Slavic Poles. 40 in Warsaw they were greeted by Russian generals, Russian officials, and Russian ladies of high rank, and in the Polish capital, amidst the deadly silence of the entire Polish population, these freedom-loving Slavs exchanged kisses and embraces with those Russian fratricides, drank with them, and cried hurrah for Slavic brotherhood. Everyone knows what kind of speeches they subsequently delivered in Moscow and Petersburg. In brief, more shameful obeisance to a brutal and merciless regime, and a more criminal betrayal of Slavic brotherhood, of truth, and of freedom on the part of venerable liberals, Democrats, and defenders of the people had never before been seen. Then these gentlemen serenely returned to Prague with their whole synod, and no one told them that what they had done was not merely base but stupid. And uselessly stupid too, for it was of no service to them whatsoever in Vienna and did not improve matters for them there. That is clear now. They have not restored the crown of Wenceslas to its former independence, and they have had to watch a new parliamentary reform remove the last arena in which they had played their political game. After its defeat in Italy, the Austrian government, having been forced to give the Kingdom of Hungary a certain measure of liberty, pondered for a long time how it would structure its Sisyphean state. Its own instincts and the demands of the German liberals and Democrats inclined it towards centralization, but the Slavs, especially Bohemia and Galicia, relying on the feudal clerical party, loudly demanded a federal system. The government's hesitation lasted until this year. It finally decided, to the horror of the Slavs and the immense joy of the German liberals and Democrats, to put the old German bureaucratic garb back on all the lands comprising the Sisyphean State 41. It should be noted, however, that the Austrian Empire has not thereby made itself stronger. It has lost its real focal point. All the Germans and youths in the empire will henceforth gravitate toward Berlin. At the same time, some of the Slavs look to Russia, while others, guided by a sure instinct, seek deliverance in the formation of a popular federation. No one expects anything from Vienna anymore. Is it not clear that the Austrian Empire, strictly speaking, is finished, and that if it still maintains the facade of existence, it is only thanks to the calculated forbearance of Russia and Prussia, which hesitate to partition it just yet because each one secretly hopes to seize the lion's share when it has the opportunity? Obviously, therefore, Austria is unable to compete with the new Prussian German Empire. Let us see if Russia is in any position to do so. Apperos were charters of local liberties granted by medieval Spanish kings. BC Appendix A at the end of this introduction. C of the 36 million inhabitants, these nationalities are distributed as follows: approximately 16,500,000 Slavs, 5 million Poles and Ruthenians, 7,250,000 other North Slavs, Czechs, Moravian, Slovaks, and 250,000 South Slavs, approximately 5,500,000 Magyars, 2,900,000 Romanians, 600,000 Italians, 9 million Germans and Jews, and some 1,500,000 others. D. The Kingdom of Hungary numbers 5,500,000 Magyars, 5 million Slavs, 2,700,000 Romanians, 1,800,000 Jews and Germans, and some 500,000 others, a total of 15,500,000 inhabitants. We are just as much sworn enemies of Pan-Slavism as we are of Pan-Germanism, and in one of our future books we intend to devote a special article to this issue, which we consider extremely important. For now, let us say only that we consider it the sacred and inescapable obligation of Russia's revolutionary youth to oppose Pan-Slav propaganda with all its might and all the resources at its disposal. This propaganda has been carried on in Russia and particularly in the Slavic lands by governmental and private Slavophiles or by official Russian agents. They try to convince the unhappy Slavs that the Slavic Tsar in Petersburg, filled with burning paternal love for his Slavic brethren, and the despicable Russian Empire, which destroys its people and is hated by them, which has oppressed Ukraine and Poland and has even sold out the latter in part to the Germans, can and will liberate the Slavic countries from the German yoke, and this at the very time when the Petersburg cabinet is patently selling out and betraying all of Bohemia and Moravia to Bismarck in return for a promise of help in the East. F. Throughout the text, Bakunin uses the term Little Russia instead of the modern term Ukraine. The latter came into common usage only toward the end of the 19th century. G. That is, in refraining from conquering Germany as well as Russia. H. The Parliament of Serbia. I. In Zurich a Slavic section has formed which has become part of the Euro Federation. We enthusiastically recommend the program of this section, which is to be found at the end of the introduction, to all the Slavs. See Appendix B. J. Term for the ruler of Muscovy, used by subject tribes of the East in the 16th century. 3. Is it not true, reader, that Russia has made unprecedented progress in every respect since the now happily reigning Emperor Alexander II came to the throne? 42. If we want to measure the progress Russia has made in the last 20 years, let us compare the distance that separated it in all areas from Europe in, say, 1856. With the distance between them now, the progress indeed has been astonishing. Russia has not risen so high, it is true, but rather Western Europe, official and semi-official, bureaucratic and bourgeois, has declined considerably, so that the gap between them has decidedly diminished. What German or Frenchman, for example, will dare speak of Russian barbarism or butchery after the horrors perpetrated by the Germans in France in 1870 and by the French forces against their own Paris in 1871? What Frenchman will dare talk about the baseness and venality of Russian officials and statesmen after all the dirt that has come to light and practically buried the French bureaucratic and political world? No, when they look at the French and the Germans, Russia's scoundrels, boors, thieves, and butchers have no cause at all to blush. In respect to morality, throughout official and semi-official Europe brutishness, or at least an astonishingly brute-like form of behavior, has firmly established itself. It is a different matter in regard to political power, although even here, at least in comparison with the French state, archivist patriots can plume themselves, for politically Russia is without doubt more independent than France and ranks higher. Bismarck himself pays court to Russia, while vanquished France pays court to Bismarck. The question is, what is the power of the All-Russian Empire in relation to the power of the Pan-German Empire, which is unquestionably predominant, at least on the European continent? We Russians, every last one of us, it may be said, know what our dear Russian Empire is like as far as its domestic life is concerned. for a small number of people, perhaps a few thousand, headed by the emperor with his most august house and his distinguished flunkies. It is an inexhaustible source of all blessings, except for those of an intellectual and moral nature. For a more extensive, though still limited minority, consisting of some tens of thousands of people, high military, civil, and ecclesiastical officials, rich landowners, merchants, capitalists, and parasites, it is an amiable, beneficent, and indulgent patron of legalized and highly lucrative thievery. For the great mass of petty officials, still insignificant in number compared to the people, it is a stingy wet nurse. And for the countless millions of laborers it is a wicked stepmother, a pitiless robber, and a torture driving them to the grave. That is what the empire was before the peasant reform, and that is what it has remained and will always be. There is no need to prove it to the Russians. What adult does not know it, cannot help but know. Russian educated society is divided into three categories: those who know it but find it too unprofitable to acknowledge its truth, which they find as unquestionable as everyone else does; those who do not acknowledge it and do not speak of it out of fear; and, finally, those who, for lack of any other kind of audacity, at least dare to talk about it. There is yet a fourth category, unfortunately too few in number, consisting of people earnestly devoted to the people's cause and not content with mere talk. Perhaps there is a fifth category, and not so few in number, of people who see nothing and understand nothing. But there is no use talking to them. Any Russian who is the least bit thoughtful and scrupulous must understand that our empire cannot alter its relationship to the people. By its very nature it is condemned to be the destroyer and bloodsucker of the people. The people hate it instinctively, and it cannot avoid oppressing them, since its entire existence and its power are built on the people's poverty. To maintain internal order, to preserve its forcibly imposed unity, and to maintain its external strength, not even for aggressive purposes but merely for self-preservation, the empire needs a vast army and police force, a countless number of bureaucrats, a state-supported clergy, in short, an official world of colossal size, with whose upkeep, not to mention its thievery, the people are inevitably saddled. One would have to be an ass, an ignoramus, or a madman to imagine that any kind of constitution, even the most liberal and democratic, could change this relationship of the state to the people for the better. It might worsen it, it might make it even more onerous and ruinous, perhaps, though that would be difficult, since the evil has been taken to such an extreme. That it might liberate the people and improve their situation, that is just nonsense. As long as the empire exists, it will victimize our people. The only kind of constitution that would be useful for the people is the destruction of the empire. So, we will not talk about its domestic circumstances, convinced as we are that they could not be any worse. Let us see, however, whether it is in fact achieving the external objective that gives meaning to its existence, not human meaning, of course, but political meaning. At the cost of huge and countless sacrifices by the people, involuntary ones, to be sure, but all the more cruel for that, has it at least been able to create a military force capable of competing, for example, with that of the new German Empire? Strictly speaking, that question sums up the entire political issue facing Russia today. The only domestic question, as we know, remains the question of social revolution. But we are dwelling for the moment on the external issue, and we ask, is Russia capable of fighting Germany? The mutual compliments, vows, kisses, and tears which the two imperial courts, that of the Berlin uncle and that of the Petersburg nephew, are currently lavishing on each other mean nothing. It is well known that in politics, none of this is worth a cent. The question we have broached is the one posed of necessity by the new position of Germany, which grew overnight into a vast and all-powerful state. All of history bears witness, and logic itself confirms, that two states of equal strength cannot exist side by side. That is contrary to their nature, which invariably and necessarily consists of and manifests itself in supremacy, and supremacy cannot tolerate equivalence. One force must inevitably be shattered and subordinated to the other. Indeed, that is now a vital necessity for Germany. After its long political humiliation, it suddenly became the mightiest power on the continent of Europe. Can it now bear to have a power next door to it, under its very nose, so to speak, that is completely independent of it, that it has not yet defeated, and that dares to regard itself as an equal? Especially when that power is Russia, the one it hates most. We believe that few Russians are unaware of how much the Germans hate Russia, all. The Germans, but particularly the German bourgeois, and under their influence, alas, the German people too. They also hate the French, but that is nothing compared to the hatred they harbor toward Russia. It constitutes one of the strongest national passions of the Germans. How did this nationwide passion come into being? Its origins were quite respectable. It was the protest of an incomparably more humane, even though German, civilization against our Tatar barbarism. Then, in the 1820s, it took on a more specific character, the protest of political liberalism against political despotism. It is well known that in the 1820s the Germans called themselves liberals and earnestly believed in their liberalism. They hated Russia as the representative of despotism. True, in all fairness they should at least have divided their hatred equally among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. But that would have been contrary to their patriotism, so they heaped all responsibility for the policies of the Holy Alliance on Russia. At the beginning of the 1830s the Polish Revolution elicited the liveliest sympathy throughout Germany, and its bloody suppression intensified the indignation of German liberals against Russia. That was perfectly natural and legitimate, though here too, justice would have demanded that at least some share of this indignation fall upon Prussia, which blatantly assisted Russia in the loathsome deed of suppressing the Poles. Nor did it do so out of magnanimity, but because its own interests demanded it. The liberation of the Kingdom of Poland and of Lithuania would have had as a direct consequence the insurrection of all of Prussian Poland, which would have destroyed the burgeoning power of the Prussian monarchy. In the second half of the 1830s, however, a new reason arose for the Germans' hatred of Russia and gave it a whole new character. No longer liberal but political and national, the Slavic question emerged, and soon a whole party formed among the Austrian and Turkish Slavs which began to hope for and expect help from Russia. Back in the 1820s, a secret society of Democrats, specifically the southern branch of this society, led by Pestal, Moravov Apostol, and Bistasa Reuman, had first conceived the idea of a free federation of all the Slavs. 43 Emperor Nicholas seized upon this idea but recast it in his own image. In his mind the free federation of all the Slavs turned into a single, autocratic pan-Slav state, under his iron scepter, of course. In the 1830s and 1840s Russian agents set out from Petersburg and Moscow for the Slavic lands, some official, others unpaid volunteers. The latter belonged to the not at all secret Moscow circle of Slavophiles. Pan-Slav propaganda began to be carried on among the West and South Slavs. A number of pamphlets appeared, some written in German, some translated into German, and they gave the pan-German public a real fright. An uproar arose among the Germans. The idea that Bohemia, an ancient imperial land penetrating to the very heart of Germany, might secede and become an independent Slavic country, or, God forbid, a Russian province, deprived them of appetite and of sleep. Curses have rained down on Russia ever since, and the Germans' hatred of Russia has grown to this very hour. Now it manifests itself on a vast scale. The Russians, for their part, do not look very kindly on the Germans either. Is it possible, given the existence of such a touching relationship, that these two neighboring empires, the All-Russian and the Pan-German, can remain at peace for very long? So far, there have been enough reasons for them to maintain peace, and indeed those reasons still exist. The first is Poland. There were three sovereign plunderers who partitioned Poland among themselves like real bandits: Austria, Prussia, and Russia. At the very moment of partition, however, and whenever the Polish question came up again subsequently, Austria was and remained the least interested. Everyone knows that the Austrian court initially protested even against partition, and only at the insistence of Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great did Empress Maria Theresa agree to take the share that fell to her. She even shed virtuous tears over it, tears which became historic, but all the same she took it. 44 And how could she not have taken it? That is what she was a crowned head for, to grab. Laws are not written for emperors, and their appetites have no bounds. In his memoirs, Frederick remarks that once the Austrian government decided to take part in the joint plunder of Poland, in a search for some non-existent river, it hastened to occupy with its troops much more territory than it was supposed to under the agreement. It is remarkable nonetheless that Austria prayed and wept as it plundered, while Russia and Prussia carried out their banditry joking and laughing. It is well known that at this very time Catherine and Frederick were conducting a most witty and philanthropic correspondence with the French philosophers. It is even more remarkable that subsequently, right up to our own day, whenever unhappy Poland made a desperate attempt to liberate and re-establish itself, the Russian and Prussian courts trembled with rage and openly or covertly hastened to join forces to put down the insurrection. Meanwhile, Austria, like an unwilling accomplice, not only refused to get excited and join in their undertaking, but, on the contrary, at the start of every new Polish insurrection acted as though it were prepared to help the Poles, and to a certain degree actually did help them. Such was the case in 1831, and even more patently in 1862, when Bismarck openly assumed the role of Russia's policeman. By contrast, Austria allowed the Poles, secretly, of course, to transport arms into Poland. What is the explanation for this difference in behavior? Is it Austria's nobility, philanthropy, and sense of justice? No, quite simply it is Austria's interest. Maria Theresa had good reason to weep. She sensed that in joining the others in violating Poland's political existence, she was digging the Austrian Empire's grave. What could be more advantageous for her than to have as a neighbor on her northeastern frontier this gentry state, not an intelligent one, true, but strictly conservative and not at all aggressive? It not only freed her from having Russia as an unpleasant neighbor but also separated her from Prussia, serving as a precious safeguard against those aggressive powers. To fail to understand this, one had to have the inveterate stupidity and especially the venality of Maria Theresa's ministers, and then the arrogant petty-mindedness and spitefully reactionary stubbornness of old Metternich, who, moreover, as everyone knows, was also in the pay of the Petersburg and Berlin courts. One had to have been condemned to death by history. The Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia understood their own mutual advantage very well. The partition of Poland gave the former the status of a great European power. The latter embarked on the road to its current incontestable preeminence. At the same time, having thrown a bloody chunk of dismembered Poland to Austria, which is gluttonous by nature, they prepared it for slaughter, condemning it to be sacrificed eventually to their own insatiable appetite. Until such time as they satisfy that appetite and divide Austria's possessions between them, they will remain, and are compelled to remain, allies and friends, even though they hate each other wholeheartedly. Of course, they will quarrel over the actual division of Austria, but until then nothing will cause them to fall out. It is not to their advantage to fall out. The new Prusso-German Empire at the present time does not have a single ally in Europe or the world as a whole except Russia and perhaps the United States. Everyone fears it, everyone hates it, and everyone will rejoice at its downfall because it oppresses and plunders everyone. Meanwhile, it still needs to carry out a number of annexations in order to realize fully the plan and idea of a pan-German empire. It must seize not just part but all of Lorraine from the French. It must annex Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Denmark, and the whole of the Scandinavian peninsula. It must also lay hands on our Baltic provinces in order to be sole master of the Baltic Sea. In short, except for the Kingdom of Hungary, which it will leave to the Magyars, and Galicia, which it will cede to Russia along with Austrian Bukovina, it will assuredly be compelled to try to seize all of Austria, up to and including Trieste, of course, Bohemia too, which the Petersburg cabinet will not even think of disputing. We are certain, we know for a fact, that secret negotiations have long been taking place between the Petersburg and German courts concerning a more or less private partition of the Austrian Empire, in which, of course, as is always the case in friendly relations between two great powers, they keep trying to swindle each other. However great the power of the Prusso-German Empire, it is clear nonetheless that by itself it is not strong enough to carry out such vast undertakings against the will of all Europe. Therefore alliance with Russia is a vital necessity and will be for a long time. Does the same necessity exist for Russia? Let us begin with the fact that our empire, more than any other, is preeminently a military state. That is not just because, from the very day it was created, it has sacrificed everything that constitutes the life and well-being of the people so as to form as great a military force as possible. It is because, as a military state, it pursues a single objective, a single mission that gives meaning to its existence: conquest. Apart from that objective, it is simply an absurdity. Hence, conquest in every direction and at whatever cost. There you have the normal life of our empire. Now the question is, in which direction should it point this aggressive force? Two paths are open to it, one western, the other eastern. The western path is aimed straight at Germany. It is the Pan-Slav path as well as the path of alliance with France against the joint forces of Prussian Germany and the Austrian Empire, with the probable neutrality of England and the United States. The other path leads directly to India, Persia, and Constantinople. The enemies here are Austria, England, and probably France, the allies Prussian Germany and the United States. Which of these two paths will our bellicose empire choose to take? It is said that the heir to the throne 45 is a passionate Pan-Slav, hates the Germans and is an inveterate friend of the French, and stands for taking the first path, while the emperor is a friend of the Germans, a loving nephew of his uncle, and stands for taking the second one. However, it is not a matter of where the sentiments of one or the other will draw him. The question is, where can the empire go with hope of success and without running the risk of destroying itself? Can it take the first path? True, that would entail alliance with France, an alliance not nearly as advantageous now in terms of material and moral force as it promised to be 3 or 4 years ago. France's national unity has been shattered irrevocably. Within the frontiers of an ostensibly unified France there now exist 3 or perhaps even 4 different and mutually antagonistic Frances, aristocratic clerical France, consisting of nobles, rich bourgeois, and priests. Purely bourgeois France, encompassing the middle and petty bourgeoisie. Worker France, including the whole urban factory proletariat. And, finally, peasant France. Except for the last two, which can reach accord and, in the south of France, for example, are already starting to do so, the possibility of these classes reaching unanimity on any point whatsoever has vanished, even when it is a matter of defending their fatherland. We saw this just the other day. The Germans are still in France, occupying Belfort while awaiting their last billion francs. Some 3 or 4 weeks remained until they would evacuate the country. But no, the majority of the assembly at Versailles, consisting of Legitimists, Orleanists, and Bonapartists, insane, rabid reactionaries, did not want to wait that long. They brought down Thiers and replaced him with Marshal MacMahon, who promises to restore moral order in France at the point of a bayonet. Point 46 Statist France has ceased to be the country of life, intellect, and magnanimous impulses. It has suddenly degenerated, as it were, and become the leading country of vileness, baseness, venality, brutality, treachery, vulgarity, and utter and amazing stupidity. Boundless obscurantism holds sway over it. It consigns itself to the Pope, the priests, the Inquisition, the Jesuits, the Virgin, and the monastery. It earnestly seeks its rebirth in the Catholic Church, its mission in the defense of Catholic interests. Religious processions cover the land and with their solemn litanies drown out the protests and complaints of the vanquished proletariat. Deputies, ministers, prefects, generals, professors, and judges march in these processions holding candles in their hands, without blushing, not with faith in their own hearts but only because the people need faith. In addition, a whole throng of religious nobles, ultramontanes, and legitimists, educated by the Jesuits, loudly demands that France solemnly consecrate itself to Christ and His Immaculate Mother, while the nation's wealth, or, more accurately, the people's labor, the producer of all wealth, is being looted by stock market speculators, swindlers, rich property owners and capitalists, while all the statesmen, government ministers, deputies, civil and military officials of every stripe, lawyers, and especially all those hypocritical Jesuits, are stuffing their pockets in the most unscrupulous fashion. All of France is actually being handed over to the government of priests. They have taken into their hands the whole educational system, the universities, gymnasia, and popular schools. They have again become the confessors and spiritual guides of the valiant French army, which will soon lose its capacity to fight external enemies but will become all the more dangerous an enemy of its own people. That is the real condition of statist France. In a very short time it has outdone Schwarzenberg post-1849 Austria, and we know how Austria ended up, defeated in Spain, defeated in Bohemia, and in a general state of ruin. France is rich, to be sure, even in spite of its recent defeat, unquestionably richer than Germany, which has derived little industrial and commercial advantage from the 5 billion francs France has paid it. This wealth allowed the French people to restore in a very short time all the outward signs of strength and regular organization. Without even looking very deeply, however, we need only glance beneath the falsely glittering surface to become convinced that everything within has rotted, and it has rotted because the whole vast body of the state no longer contains so much as a spark of a living soul. Statist France is irrevocably finished, and anyone who counts on an alliance with it will be cruelly deceived. He will find nothing within it but impotence and fear. It has dedicated itself to the Pope, Christ, the Mother of God, divine reason and human folly. It has been sacrificed to thieves and priests, and if it still has any military strength left, it will go entirely into subduing and suppressing its own proletariat. What use can there be in an alliance with it? But there is a more important reason that will never permit our government, be it headed by Alexander II or Alexander III, to follow the path of Western or Pan-Slav conquest. This is a revolutionary path, in the sense that it leads directly to the revolt of nations, primarily Slavs, against their legitimate sovereigns, Austrian and Prusso-German. It was suggested to Emperor Nicholas by Prince Paskevich 47, Nicholas's situation was perilous. He had two of the strongest powers, England and France, opposing him. Grateful Austria threatened him. Only Prussia, which he had offended, remained faithful, but even Prussia, yielding to pressure from the other three states, was beginning to waver, and along with the Austrian government was making imposing representations to him 48 Nicholas, who believed that his glory lay chiefly in his reputation for inflexibility, had either to yield or to die. To yield was shameful, but to die, of course, was undesirable. At that critical moment it was suggested to him that he raise the standard of Pan-Slavism, and, moreover, that he placed the Phrygian Kappa atop his imperial crown and summon not just the Slavs but the Magyars, Romanians, and Italians to revolt. Nicholas thought it over, but, to do him justice, he did not hesitate for long. He realized that he ought not end this long career of purist despotism by taking up the career of a revolutionary. He preferred to die. He was right. One could not plume oneself on one's despotism within the state while stirring up revolution outside it. It would have been particularly impossible for Nicholas, because the moment he set foot on this path he would have come face to face with Poland. How could he call on the Slavs and other nations to revolt while continuing to stifle Poland? But what was to be done with Poland? Liberate it? No, even aside from the fact that this was contrary to all of Nicholas's instincts, he could not help but realize that the liberation of Poland was absolutely incompatible with the idea of the Russian state. A struggle between two forms of statehood had gone on for centuries. The question was, which would prevail, the Polish gentry's freedom or the Russian Tsarist knout? Nothing was said about the people in either camp. In both, they were in equal measure slaves and toilers, the breadwinners and new pedestals of the state. It seemed at first that the Poles would win out. They had education, military skill, and bravery on their side, and since their army consisted predominantly of petty gentry they fought as free men, while the Russians fought as slaves. All the odds seemed to be in their favor. In fact, for a very long period of time they emerged the victors in every war, ravaged Russian provinces, and once even subjugated Moscow and installed the son of their own king on the Tsarist throne. The force that drove them out of Moscow was not that of the Tsar or even of the boyars but of the people. Until the masses intervened in the struggle, fortune favored the Poles. As soon as the people themselves came on stage, however, once in 1612, again in the form of the unanimous uprising of the Ukrainian and Lithuanian peasantry under the leadership of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, 49 fortune utterly abandoned them. From then on, the Polish gentry Free State began to wither and decline, until it finally perished. The Russian now was victorious thanks to the people and together with them, to the great detriment of the people themselves, of course, who as a mark of this state's sincere gratitude were handed over as hereditary slaves to the Tsar's servants, the noble landowners. The now reigning emperor, Alexander II, is said to have emancipated the peasants. We know what kind of an emancipation it was. Meanwhile, the now Russian Empire was being founded on the very ruins of the Polish gentry state. Deprive it of that foundation, take away the provinces that until 1772 were part of the Polish state, and the Russian Empire will disappear. It will disappear because with the loss of those provinces, its richest, most fruitful, and most populous, its wealth, which is not exceptional to begin with, and its power will diminish by half. This loss will immediately be followed by the loss of the Baltic territories. Assuming also that a Polish state is restored not just on paper but in actuality, and will begin a new and vigorous life, the empire will very soon lose all of Ukraine, which will become either a Polish province or an independent state. Thereby it will also lose its Black Sea frontier and will be cut off from Europe on all sides and driven back into Asia. Some people believe that the empire can at least give Lithuania back to Poland. No, it cannot, for the very same reasons. A united Lithuania and Poland would surely, and, one might say, inexorably, serve Polish state patriotism as a broad-pointed departure for conquest of the Baltic provinces and Ukraine. It would be enough just to liberate the Kingdom of Poland. Warsaw would immediately unite with Vilna, Grodno, Minsk, and perhaps Kiev, not to mention Podolia and Volhynia 50. How could that happen? The Poles are such an unruly people that not a single free town can be left to them. They will immediately start to conspire in it and to establish secret ties with all their lost provinces with the aim of restoring the Polish state. In 1841, for example, Krakow was the one free city they had left, and Krakow became the center of all Polish revolutionary activity. 51. Is it not clear that the Russian Empire can prolong its existence only on the condition that it stifle Poland in accordance with the Muratov system? We are speaking of the empire, not of the Russian people, who, we are convinced, have nothing in common with it and whose interests and instinctive aspirations are completely contrary to the empire's interests and conscious aspirations. Once the empire collapses and the Great Russian, Ukrainian, White Russian, and other peoples regain their freedom, the ambitious plans of the Polish state patriots will hold no terror for them. They are deadly only for the empire. That is why no Russian emperor, assuming he is in his right mind and is not compelled by iron necessity, will ever consent to liberate even the smallest portion of Poland. And if he does not liberate the Poles, can he call on the Slavs to revolt? The reasons that prevented Nicholas from raising the Pan-Slav standard of revolt still apply in full, the difference being that this path promised more rewards in his time than it does today. Then one could still count on an insurrection of the Magyars and of Italy, which were under the hated Austrian yoke. Now Italy would doubtless remain neutral, since Austria would probably hand over without argument those few scraps of Italian land still in its possession, just to have done with it. As for the Magyars, it can be said for sure that with all the passion inspired by their own domination of the Slavs, they would take the German side against Russia. So, in the event of a Pan-Slav war instigated by the Russian Emperor against Germany, he could count on the more or less active assistance only of the Slavs, and of it only of the Austrian Slavs, for if he took it into his head to stir up the Turkish Slavs too, he would create a new enemy, England, the jealous defender of the Ottoman state's sovereignty. But in Austria the Slavs number approximately 17 million. Subtract the 5 million inhabitants of Galicia, where the more or less sympathetic Ruthenians would be paralyzed by the hostile Poles, and that leaves 12 million on whose revolt the Russian emperor might be able to count, excluding, of course, those drafted into the Austrian army, who, following the custom of any army, would fight whomever the commanders ordered them to fight. Let us add that these 12 million Slavs are not even concentrated in one locality or in several but are scattered across the whole expanse of the Austrian Empire, speak totally different dialects, and are intermingled with the German, Magyar, Romanian, and Italian population. They are numerous enough to keep the Austrian government and the Germans in general in a constant state of anxiety, but too few to afford a Russian army serious support against the combined forces of Prussian Germany and Austria. Alas! The Russian government knows this and has always understood it very well. Therefore it has never had, and will never have, any intention of conducting a pan-Slav war against Austria, which would necessarily turn into a war against all of Germany. If our government has no such intention, however, then why does it carry on real pan-Slav propaganda through its agents in Austria's possessions? For a very simple reason, one we just indicated, because the Russian government finds it very agreeable and useful to have a multitude of fervent but blind, not to say stupid, adherents in all the Austrian provinces. It paralyzes, constrains, and worries the Austrian government, and it increases Russia's influence not just on Austria but on Germany as a whole. Imperial Russia incites the Austrian Slavs against the Magyars and the Germans, knowing full well that in the end it will betray them to those same Magyars and Germans. It is a despicable but thoroughly statist game. Thus, the Russian Empire will find few allies and little real support in the West in the event of a pan-Slav war against the Germans. Let us look now at whom it will have to fight. First, all the Germans, both Prussian and Austrian, second, the Magyars, and third, the Poles. Leaving aside the Poles and even the Magyars, let us ask whether Imperial Russia is capable of conducting an offensive war against the combined forces of Prussia and Austria, or even Prussia alone. We say an offensive war because we assume Russia would initiate it under the pretense of liberating the Austrian Slavs, though with the actual intention of annexing them. First of all, it is indisputable that in Russia no offensive war will be a national war. It is almost a general rule, nations rarely taken. Active part in wars undertaken and conducted by their governments beyond the frontiers of their fatherland. Such wars are in most cases exclusively political, except when they are combined with a religious or revolutionary ideal. For the Germans, French, Dutch, English, and even the Swedes, the wars of the 16th century between the Reformers and the Catholics contained such an ideal, as did the Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century for the French. In recent history, however, we know of only two exceptional examples of the masses regarding with real sympathy political wars undertaken by their governments for the purpose of expanding the boundaries of their states, or for the sake of other exclusively political interests. The first example is that of the French people under Napoleon I. It is not sufficiently indicative, however, because the imperial armies were a direct continuation, a natural result, as it were, of the revolutionary armies, so that the French people, even after the fall of Napoleon, continued to view them as an expression of the same revolutionary ideal. Much more telling is the second example, that of the ardent rapture experienced by the entire German people in the absurd, colossal war undertaken by the newly formed Prusso-German state against the Second French Empire. Yes, at that significant moment, which has just gone by, the entire German nation, all strata of German society, with the possible exception of a small handful of workers, were motivated by an exclusively political interest to found and expand the boundaries of a pan-German state. And that interest still prevails over every other in the minds and hearts of all the Germans, whatever their estate, and it is what constitutes Germany's special strength today. To anyone who knows and understands anything about Russia, however, it should be clear that no offensive war undertaken by our government will be a national war. In the first place, our people are not only alien to any political interest but are even instinctively opposed to it. The state is their prison, why should they make it stronger? In the second place, no bond exists between government and people, not a single vital thread that might unite them even for a moment in any cause whatsoever. There is not even any capability, any possibility of mutual understanding. What is white to the government is black to the people, and, conversely, what seems very white to the people, what constitutes their life and liberty, is death to the government. It might be asked, perhaps, with Pushkin, or is the word of the Russian Tsar already powerless? 52. Yes, powerless, when it demands of the people what is repugnant to them. Just let the Tsar wink and call out to the people, tie up and slaughter the landowners, officials, and merchants, seize their property and divide it up among yourselves. In an instant all the Russian people would rise up, and by the next day not even a trace of merchants, officials, or landowners would remain in the Russian land. But as long as he orders the people to pay taxes and provide soldiers for the state, and to work for the benefit of the landowners and merchants, the people will obey unwillingly, under the lash, as they do today, and will refuse to obey whenever they can. Where, then, is the magical and wonder-working effect of the Tsar's word? And what can the Tsar say to the people that would stir their hearts and kindle their imaginations? In 1828, when he declared war on the Ottoman Porte on the pretext of offenses suffered by our Greek and Slavic co-religionists in Turkey, Emperor Nicholas tried to incite religious fanaticism in the people with his manifesto, which was read to them in the churches. The attempt was a complete failure. If a fierce and stubborn piety exists anywhere in Russia, it is only among the old believers, who least of all recognize the state or even the emperor himself. 53 In the Orthodox and official church, however, routine and lifeless ritual reigns alongside the most profound indifference. At the beginning of the Crimean campaign, when England and France declared war, Nicholas again tried to incite religious fanaticism in the people, and just as unsuccessfully. Remember what was said among the people during that war: the Frenchman is demanding that we be set free. There were popular militias, but everyone knows how they were formed, for the most part by order of the Tsar and at the command of the authorities. It was army recruitment, but in a different form and for a fixed period of time. In many places the peasants were promised that when the war ended they would be emancipated. That is the kind of political interest our peasants have. Among the merchants and gentry, patriotism was expressed in highly original form, in foolish speeches, in loud declarations of loyalty to the Tsar, and particularly in banquets and drinking parties. But when the time came for some to provide funds and others to lead their peasants off to war themselves, there turned out to be very few enthusiasts. Everyone tried to find someone else to take his place. The militia made a lot of noise but proved of no use. And the Crimean War was not even an offensive war. It was defensive, meaning that it could have and should have become a national war. Why did it not? Because our upper classes are corrupt, paltry, and base, and the people are the natural enemies of the state. And they hope to stir the people up over the Slavic question. Among our Slavophiles there are some honest individuals who seriously believe that the Russian people are burning with impatience to fly to the aid of their Slavic brethren, of whose existence they are not even aware. They would be highly astonished to be told that they themselves are a Slavic nation. Tuchinski and his Polish and French followers, of course, deny that Slavic blood flows in the veins of the great Russian people, thereby sinning against historical and ethnographic truth. 54 But Tuchinski, who knows our people so little, probably does not even suspect that they are not at all concerned with their Slavic origin. What does it matter to them, when they are exhausted, starving, and oppressed by a supposedly Slavic but actually tattered Germanic empire? We should not deceive the Slavs. Those who speak to them of any participation whatsoever by the Russian people in the Slavic question are either cruelly deluding themselves or are lying shamelessly, and, of course, with dishonest intentions. And if we Russian socialists and revolutionaries summon the Slavic proletariat and Slavic youth to a common cause, let us not offer them our more or less Slavic origin as the common ground for that cause. The only common ground we can recognize is social revolution, without which we see no deliverance either for their nations or for our own. We believe that on this ground they can unite fraternally, thanks to the many identical features in the character, historic destiny, and past and present aspirations of all the Slavic peoples, and their identical attitude toward the status pretensions of the Germans. Their objective will not be to form a common state but to destroy all states. and not to isolate themselves but to enter a worldwide sphere of activity, beginning perforce with a close alliance with the Latin nations, who, like the Slavs, are now threatened by the aggressive policy of the Germans. Even that alliance should last only until the Germans realize from their own experience what calamities the existence even of a pseudo-popular state entails for the people, cast off the yoke of the state, and renounce forever their unfortunate passion for state supremacy. Then, and only then, will the three principal nationalities of Europe, the Latin, Slavic, and German, form a free alliance, as brothers. Until then, however, an alliance of the Slavic and Latin nations against the German aggression that threatens all of them will remain a bitter necessity. The Germans have a strange mission. By provoking a common sense of danger and a common hatred, they bring nations together. Thus they have united the Slavs, for there is no doubt that the hatred of the Germans, which is deeply rooted in the hearts of all the Slavic peoples, has furthered the success of Pan-Slav propaganda more than all the preaching and intrigue of Moscow's and Petersburg's agents. Now the same hatred will probably draw the Slavs into alliance with the Latins. In this sense the Russians too are a wholly Slavic people, in that they have no love for the Germans. But we should not deceive ourselves, their antipathy does not go so far that they will of their own accord make war on them. That will happen only when the Germans themselves invade Russia and try to establish their sway over it. Anyone who counts on any participation by our people in an offensive action against Germany will prove deeply mistaken. Hence it follows that if our government ever takes it into its head to make such a move, it will have to do it without any popular assistance, with the financial and military resources of the state alone. Are those resources sufficient to fight Germany? Much less to conduct a successful offensive war against it? One would have to be an exceptional ignoramus or a blind vos patriot not to realize that all our military resources and our illustrious, seemingly numberless army are nothing compared to the resources and army of Germany. The Russian soldier is undeniably brave, but German soldiers are certainly no cowards. They proved that in 3 successive campaigns. Moreover, in any offensive war on Russia's part, the German forces will be fighting on home ground and will be supported by a patriotic, and this time really universal, uprising of all classes and the whole population of Germany, as well as by their own patriotic fanaticism, while the Russian troops will be fighting without purpose and without passion, merely in obedience to their commanders. As far as a comparison of Russian and German officers is concerned, from a purely human point of view, we would give that advantage to our officers, not because they are ours but on grounds of strict fairness. Despite all the efforts of our Minister of War Milyutin, 55, the great mass of our officer corps has remained just as it was before, crude, ignorant, and in almost every respect completely mindless. Military exercises, carousing, card playing, drunkenness, and, whenever there is a profit to be made, systematic, almost legalized thievery in the upper ranks, starting with the company or squadron or battery commander. These are still the daily indulgences of officer life in Russia. It is a thoroughly vacuous and uncivilized world, even when French is spoken in it. Amidst the crude and absurd slovenliness with which it is filled, however, a human heart can still be found, an instinctive capacity to love and understand mankind, and in the right conditions, under a good influence, the ability to become a fully conscious friend of the people. In the world of the German officers there is nothing but form, military regulations, and a repugnant arrogance peculiar to officers. This last consists of 2 elements: servile obedience to anyone who is hierarchically superior, and insolent contempt for anyone who, in their opinion, is inferior. First of all, the people, then anyone who does not wear a military uniform, with the exception of the highest civilian officials and nobles. In relation to a sovereign, be he a duke, a king, or now the all-German emperor, the German officer is a slave by conviction, by passion. At a nod from them the officer is prepared at any time and any place to commit the most terrible atrocities, to burn down, wipe out, and slaughter dozens or hundreds of towns and villages, not just foreign ones but even his own. He feels not only contempt for the people but hatred, because, doing them too much honor, he assumes that they are always in revolt, or on the brink of revolt. He is not the only one, however. All the privileged classes make the same assumption these days, and the German officer, in fact any officer of a regular army, can be termed the privileged guard dog of the privileged classes. The whole world of exploiters, in Germany and outside of Germany, views the people with fear and distrust, which are not always justified, unfortunately, but which nonetheless prove beyond doubt that within the masses the conscious force that will destroy this world is beginning to arise. So, at the very thought of popular crowds, the German officer's hair bristles, like that of a good guard dog. His conception of the people's rights and duties is highly patriarchal. In his opinion, the people should work so their masters may be clothed and fed. They should obey the authorities without question, and pay their state taxes and communal obligations. They should take their turn as soldiers, clean the officer's boots, bring him his horse, and shoot, slash, and cut down anybody and everybody whenever he gives the command and brandishes his saber, and go to their death for Kaiser and Vaterland when ordered to do so. When their term of active duty is over, they should live on charity if they have been wounded or crippled, but if they remain whole and unharmed they should enter the reserves and serve there till they die, always obeying the authorities, bowing down before any superior, and ready to die on demand. Any development among the people that contradicts this ideal is capable of sending the German officer into a rage. It is not difficult to imagine how he must hate revolutionaries. But under this general term he includes all Democrats and even liberals. In other words, anyone who in any manner or form dares to do, will, or think anything contrary to the inviolable thought and will of His Imperial Majesty, the sovereign of all the Germanies. One can imagine the special hatred with which he must regard his country's revolutionary socialists or even social democrats. The very thought of them drives him into a frenzy, and he considers it unseemly to speak of them without foaming at the mouth. Woe to those who fall into his clutches, and unfortunately it must be said that a number of social democrats in Germany have passed through an officer's hands of late. He does not have the right to tear them to pieces or summarily shoot them, and he does not dare to give free rein to his fists, so he employs the grossest insults, harassments, gestures, and words in the effort to vent his furious, mean-spirited side. But if he were allowed, if the authorities gave the order, he would take on the role of torturer, hangman, and butcher with ferocious zeal and, above all, with an officer's pride. Just take a look at the civilized brute, this lackey by conviction and executioner by calling. If he is young, you will be surprised to see not a monster but a blonde youth, fresh-faced and downy-cheeked, modest, quiet and even bashful, proud. The arrogance shows through, and unfailingly sentimental. He knows Schiller and Goethe by heart, and all the humanistic literature of the great 18th century has passed through his head, without leaving a single humane thought in it or a single humane emotion in his heart. It was left to the Germans, and particularly German officials and officers, to solve a seemingly insoluble problem: how to combine education and barbarism, learning and servility. It makes them repulsive and at the same time highly comical in its social sense, systematic and merciless villains in relation to the masses, but valued individuals in respect to state service. The German burghers know this and patriotically endure all the insults they receive from them, partly because they recognize their own character in them, but chiefly because they regard these privileged imperial guard dogs, who so often meet them out of boredom, as the most reliable bulwark of the pan-German state. For a regular army, it is really hard to imagine anything better than the German officer. He is a man who combines learning with doltishness with valor, strict fulfillment of orders with a capacity for initiative, discipline with brutality with a peculiar kind of honesty, and a certain exaltation, albeit one-sided and even disagreeable, with uncommon obedience to the will of the authorities. Ever capable of slashing or hacking apart dozens, hundreds, thousands of people at the least sign from his commanders, he is quiet, modest, submissive, obedient, always at attention before his superiors, and arrogant, disdainfully cold, and, when necessary, even cruel in relation to the ordinary soldier. His whole life is expressed in two words: obey and command. A man like that is irreplaceable for an army and a state. As far as the training of the soldiers is concerned, one of the chief concerns in the organization of a good army, it has been brought to a systematic, carefully planned, and empirically tested degree of perfection in the German army. The main principle underlying this discipline is contained in the following aphorism, which we still heard repeated not long ago by the many Prussian, Saxon, Bavarian, and other German officers who have been traipsing around Switzerland in droves since the French campaign, probably to study the terrain and draw maps. They might come in handy in the future. To master the soldier as soul, you must first master his body. And how do you master his body? By means of incessant exercises. Do not get the idea that German officers scorn drilling, not at all. They view it as one of the best ways to condition the limbs and master the soldier's body. Then there's rifle practice, weapons maintenance, cleaning uniforms. The soldier has to be kept occupied from morning till night and feel the stern, coldly magnetizing eye of his commanders upon him at every step. In winter, when there is a little more time available, the soldiers are sent to school, where they are taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but above all are forced to learn by heart the military regulations, which are imbued with deification of the emperor and contempt for the people. Present arms to the emperor but shoot at the people. That is the quintessence of the soldier's moral and political education. Having spent 3, 4, or 5 years in this maelstrom, the soldier can emerge from it only as a monster. The same is true of the officer, though in a different form. The soldier is meant to become an unconscious weapon. The officer, however, is supposed to be a conscious one, a weapon by conviction, thought, interest, and passion. His world is the officer corps. He does not set foot beyond it, and the whole corps, permeated with the spirit described above, watches over each of its members. Woe to the unfortunate individual who gets carried away by inexperience or by some humane sentiment and allows himself to become friendly with some other circle. If it is a politically harmless one, he will merely be laughed at. But if it has a political orientation not in accord with the general orientation of the officers, if it is liberal or democratic, let alone social revolutionary, then the poor fellow is done for. Each of his comrades will become an informer on him. In general, the higher authorities prefer the officers to keep to themselves for the most part, and they try to leave them, as well as the soldiers, as little free time as possible. Drilling the soldiers and constantly supervising them takes up 3/4 of the officer's day. The remaining quarter is supposed to be devoted to improving his proficiency in military science. Before rising to the rank of major, the officer has to pass several examinations. In addition, he is given periodic assignments on various subjects, and these are used to judge his aptitude for promotion. As we see, the German military, just like the French, is a completely self-contained world, which serves as a reliable guarantee that it will be the enemy of the people. But the German military has an enormous advantage over that of the French and indeed of the rest of Europe. German officers surpass all others in the extent and scientific quality of their knowledge, their theoretical and practical grasp of military matters, their zealous and quite scholarly dedication to the military profession, their exactitude, thoroughness, endurance, stubborn perseverance, and also their relative honesty. As a result of all these qualities, the organization and armament of the German forces exists in reality and not just on paper, as was the case in France under Napoleon III and is nearly always the case in Russia. Moreover, thanks to those same German advantages, administrative, civil, and especially military audits are carried out in such a way that protracted fraud is impossible. In Russia, by contrast, from top to bottom and bottom to top one hand washes the other, so that it becomes almost impossible to find out the truth. Keep all this in mind and ask yourself whether a Russian army could possibly hope for success in an offensive war against Germany. You will say that Russia can raise 1 million troops. Well, perhaps not 1 million well-organized and well-armed troops, but let us suppose that there are 1 million. Half them will have to remain dispersed across the vast expanse of the empire to maintain order among the happy people, who might grow finicky from good living if you do not keep an eye on them. How many troops would be needed for Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland alone? A lot, if you are going to send a 500,000-man army against Germany. Russia has never yet raised such an army. In Germany, you will encounter an army that really does number 1,000,000, the foremost army in the world in terms of organization, training, science, spirit, and armament. Behind it, as a huge militia, will stand the entire German nation, which possibly, and even probably, would not have risen up against the French had the victor in the recent war been Napoleon III instead of the Prussian Fritz, see but which, we reiterate, will rise up unanimously against the Russian invasion. You will say that in case of need Russia, meaning the Russian Empire, is capable of raising another 1,000,000 troops. And why not, if only on paper, all it takes is to issue a decree for a new levy of recruits, so many per 1,000 men, and there you have your 1,000,000. But how are they to be mustered? Who will muster them? Your reserve generals, adjutant generals, aides-de-camp, commanders of paper reserve and garrison battalions, your governors and bureaucrats? My lord, how many tens or even hundreds of thousands of men they will starve to death before they get them assembled? And finally, where will you find a sufficient number of officers to organize 1,000,000 new troops, and what will you arm them with? Sticks? You do not have the funds to arm 1,000,000 properly, and you are threatening to arm another 1,000,000. No banker will loan you the money, and even if he does, it will take years to equip 1,000,000 men. Let us compare your poverty and feebleness with the Germans' wealth and strength. Germany received 5 billion francs from France. Let us assume that 3 billion were spent to offset various expenses, to reward princes, statesmen, generals, colonels, and other officers, not the soldiers, of course, and also for various domestic and foreign junkets. That leaves 2 billion, which are being used exclusively to arm Germany, to build new fortresses or strengthen a countless number of old ones, to order new cannon, rifles, and so forth. Indeed, the whole of Germany has been turned into a formidable arsenal, bristling with weapons on all sides. And you, with your haphazard training and armament, hope to defeat it. At your first step, the moment you poke your nose onto German soil, you will get your head severely battered, and your offensive war will turn straight away into a defensive one. German troops will cross the frontiers of the Russian Empire. But then, at least, will they not provoke a general uprising of the Russian people against them? Yes, if the Germans penetrate into the Russian provinces and head straight for Moscow, for example. But if, instead of doing anything that's stupid, they proceed north to Petersburg through the Baltic provinces, they will find a great many friends, not only among the petty bourgeoisie, the Protestant pastors, and the Yids, but also among the discontented German barons and their children, the students, and through them among our countless Baltic generals, officers, and higher and lower officials who fill Petersburg and are scattered throughout Russia. Moreover, they will stir up Poland and Ukraine against the Russian Empire. It is true that of all Poland's enemies and oppressors, from the day it was partitioned, Prussia proved to be the most persistent, the most systematic, and therefore the most dangerous. Russia behaved like a barbarian, like a savage force, slaughtering, hanging, torturing, exiling thousands to Siberia, and still could not Russify the part of Poland that fell to it, nor can it even to this day, despite Moravic's methods. Austria, for its part, has not Germanized Galicia at all, nor has it even tried. Prussia, as the true representative of the German spirit and the great German mission of forcibly and artificially Germanizing non-German countries, immediately set to work to Germanize at whatever cost the province of Danzig and the Duchy of Poznan, not to mention the Königsberg region which it had obtained much earlier. It would take too long to describe the methods Prussia used to achieve this objective. Among them, extensive colonization of Polish land by German peasants occupied a prominent place. Full emancipation of the peasants in 1807, with the right to purchase land and with every possible assistance in making such purchases, greatly enhanced the popularity of the Prussian government, even among the Polish peasants. Then village schools were established, and in them and through them the German language was introduced. As a result of these measures, by 1848 more than a third of the Duchy of Poznan had been Germanized. There is no need even to mention the towns. From the very beginning of Polish history, German was spoken there, thanks to the throngs of German burghers, artisans, and especially Yids, to whom they offered broad hospitality. It is well known that since ancient times the majority of the towns in this part of Poland were governed according to the so-called Magdeburg Law 56. That is how Prussia pursued its objective in times of peace. Whenever Polish patriotism provoked or tried to provoke a popular movement, however, Prussia did not hesitate to adopt the most drastic and barbaric measures. We have already had occasion to remark that in the task of quelling Polish uprisings, not only within its own frontiers but also in the Kingdom of Poland, Prussia always displayed unfailing loyalty to the Russian government and the most fervent readiness to assist it. Prussian police, indeed, magnanimous Prussian officers of both the guards and the army, with a certain special zeal hunted down Poles hiding in Prussian territory and with malicious pleasure handed them over to the Russian police, often expressing the hope that the Russians would hang them. In this regard, Muravova hangman could not speak highly enough of Prince Bismarck. Until Bismarck's ministry, Prussia always acted in this manner but did it shamefacedly, on the quiet, and whenever possible, disavowed its own actions. Bismarck was the first to throw off the mask. Loudly and cynically he not only acknowledged but boasted in the Prussian parliament and to European diplomats that the Prussian government was using all its influence on the government of Russia to persuade it to suppress Poland completely, to stop at nothing in the use of bloody measures, and that in this regard Prussia would always render Russia the most active assistance. Finally, not long ago, Bismarck bluntly declared in Parliament the government's firm resolve to eradicate all vestiges of Polish nationality in the Polish provinces that currently enjoy the German administration. Unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier, the Poles of Poznan, like those of Galicia, have now bound the Polish national cause more closely than ever to the issue of the supremacy of papal power. Their advocates are Jesuits, Ultramontanes, monastic orders, and bishops. A lot of good this alliance and this friendship will do them, as much good as it did them in the 17th century. But that is the Poles' business, not ours. We have mentioned all this in order to show that the Poles have no enemy more dangerous and vicious than Bismarck. He seems to have made it his life's work to wipe them off the face of the earth. All the same, it will not prevent him from calling on the Poles to rebel against Russia when Germany's interests demand it. And even though the Poles detest him in Prussia, not to mention the whole of Germany, even if they do not care to admit it, even though a historic hatred of the Germans dwells deep in their hearts as it does in all the other Slavic peoples, and even though they cannot forget the mortal insults they have endured at the hands of the Prussian Germans, the Poles will without doubt rise up at Bismarck's call. In Germany, and in Prussia itself, a large and serious political party has long existed, actually 3 parties, one liberal progressive, one purely democratic, and one social-democratic, 57, which together form an indisputable majority in the German and Prussian parliaments and an even more decisive majority in the society itself, parties which, foreseeing, to some degree desiring, and in a sense calling for a war by Germany against Russia, understood that the insurrection and within certain boundaries the re-establishment of Poland would be a necessary condition for such a war. It goes without saying that neither Bismarck nor any of those parties will ever agree to give Poland back all of the provinces Prussia took from it. Nothing in the world will induce them to give up Danzig or even the merest scrap of West Prussia, not to mention Königsberg. They will even detach a considerable part of the Duchy of Poznan for themselves, claiming that it is now completely Germanized. Of the segment of Poland that fell to the Prussians, they will leave the Poles essentially very little. To make up for it, they will give them all of Galicia, including Wau and Krakow, since it now belongs to Austria, and even more gladly will give them as much territory far inside Russia as they have the power to seize and hold. In addition, they will offer the Poles the funds they need, in the form, of course, of a Polish loan guaranteed by Germany, arms, and military assistance. Who can doubt that the Poles will not only agree to the Germans' offer but will jump at it? Their situation is so desperate that if they were made an offer 100 times worse, they would accept it. It has now been a century since the partition of Poland, and in those 100 years scarcely a single one has passed without Polish patriots shedding their blood as martyrs. 100 years of uninterrupted struggle, of desperate revolts. Is there any other nation that can boast of such valor? What have the Poles not tried? Gentry conspiracies, petty bourgeois plots, armed bands, national insurrections, and finally all the tricks of diplomacy and even the aid of the church. They have tried everything, they have grasped at every straw, and everything has crumbled in their hands, everything has betrayed them. How can they refuse when Germany itself, their most dangerous enemy, offers to assist them on certain conditions? Perhaps there are Slavophiles who will accuse them of betrayal. Betrayal of what? Of the Slavic cause, the Slavic alliance? But what does that cause consist of, and how has that alliance manifested itself? Was it not in the trip Polaki and Rieger made to Moscow for the Pan-Slav exhibition, and their obeisance to the Tsar? How and when, by what deed, have the Slavs, as Slavs, expressed their fraternal sympathy for the Poles? Was it not when the same Polaki and Rieger and their multitudinous retinue of West and South Slavs exchanged kisses in Warsaw with Russian generals who had scarcely washed the Poles' blood from their hands, and toasted Slavic brotherhood and the health of the Tsar women? The Poles are martyrs and heroes, and they have great glory in their past. The Slavs are still children, and their entire significance lies in the future. The Slavic world, the Slavic question, is not a reality but a hope, and a hope which can be fulfilled only by means of a social revolution. So far, however, the Poles have shown little enthusiasm for such a revolution, meaning, of course, the Polish patriots, who for the most part belong to the educated class and predominantly to the gentry. What can the Slavic world, which does not yet exist, and the world of the Polish patriots, which has more or less outlived its day, have in common? In fact, except for a very few individuals who are trying to raise the Slavic question in a Polish spirit and on Polish soil, the Poles are generally not interested in it. They find it much easier to understand the Magyars and feel closer to them. They have some similarity to them and share a number of historical memories with them, while they are divided from the South and West Slavs particularly, and categorically, one may say, by the latter as sympathies for Russia, the Poles' most hated enemy. In Poland and in the Polish emigration, as in any other country, the political world was formally divided into a number of parties. There was an aristocratic party, a clerical party, and a party of constitutional monarchists. There was a party in support of military dictatorship, a party of moderate Republicans, admirers of the United States, a party of red Republicans along French lines. Finally, even a small party of Social Democrats, not to mention the mystical sect parties, or, more accurately, church parties. One only needed to look into each of them a little more deeply, however, to be convinced that essentially they all had the same basis, a passionate desire to re-establish the Polish state within the frontiers of 1772. Aside from the mutual antagonism of the leaders, what chiefly distinguished them from one another was each party's conviction that this common objective, restoration of the old Poland, could be achieved only by the particular means it recommended. Until 1850, it can be said, the vast majority of the Polish emigration was revolutionary, for it was confident that the restoration of an independent Poland would inevitably result from the triumph of revolution in Europe. It can also be said that in 1848 there was not a single movement in the whole of Europe in which the Poles did not participate, often even assuming the leadership. We recall how when Saxon German expressed his astonishment on the score, wherever there is so much as a disturbance, there are sure to be Poles. In 1850, with revolution defeated everywhere, faith in it declined, Napoleon's star rose, and a great many Polish émigrés, the vast majority of them, became fierce and thoroughgoing Bonapartists. My lord, what did they not hope to achieve with Napoleon? Ill's help. Even his flagrant, despicable treason in 1862-63 was not enough to destroy their faith. 58 it was extinguished only at Sedan. After that catastrophe the only remaining refuge for the Poles' hopes was the Jesuits and Ultramontanes. The Austrian and most other Polish patriots scurried to Galicia in desperation. But imagine Bismarck, their inveterate enemy, forced by Germany's situation to call on them to revolt against Russia. He will not offer them far-fetched hopes. No, he will give them money, arms, and military aid. Is there any possibility of their rejecting it? It is true that in return for that aid they will be required to make a formal renunciation of the greater part of the old Polish lands now in the possession of Prussia. They will find it a very bitter pill, but forced by circumstances and certain of triumphing over Russia, consoling themselves in the end with the thought that if only Poland be restored they will get back what belongs to them afterward, they will unquestionably rise up, and from their point of view they will be right 10,000 times over. True, Poland restored with the aid of German troops and under the patronage of Prince Bismarck will be a strange Poland. But better a strange Poland than none at all. And eventually, ultimately, the Poles will surely reckon they will be able to liberate themselves from Bismarck's patronage too. In short, the Poles will agree to everything. Poland will rise up, Lithuania will rise up, and a little later Ukraine will rise up too. The Polish patriots are bad socialists, to be sure, and at home they will not occupy themselves with revolutionary socialist propaganda. Even if they wanted to, their protector, Prince Bismarck, would not allow it. It is too close to Germany, and who knows, such propaganda might even make its way into Prussian Poland. But what cannot be done in Poland can be done in Russia and against Russia. It would be highly useful for both the Germans and the Poles to stir up the peasant rebellion there, and it would not be hard to do. Just think how many Poles and Germans are scattered around Russia. Most if not all of them would be natural allies of Bismarck and the Poles. Imagine the situation. Our troops, their heads battered, will flee. On their heels in the north the Germans will march on Petersburg, and in the west and south the Poles will march on Smolensk and Ukraine, while at the same time, in Russia and in Ukraine, a universal, triumphant peasant rebellion is taking place, incited by external and domestic propaganda. That is why it can be said with assurance that no Russian government and no Russian Tsar, unless he is demented, will ever raise the standard of Pan-Slavism and make war on Germany. Having conclusively defeated first Austria and then France, the great new German Empire will permanently reduce to the level of second-rank powers and German dependencies not only those two states but eventually our Russian Empire as well, which it has cut off from Europe for good. We are referring, of course, to the Empire, not to the Russian people, who will break a path for themselves wherever they need to go. For the Russian Empire, however, the gates of Europe now are locked. Prince Bismarck holds the keys to them, and not for anything in the world will he give them to Prince Gorka Kant 59. But if the gates to the northwest are barred to the Empire forever, are not the gates to the south and southeast still open, and perhaps more dependably and more widely, Bukhara, Persia, Afghanistan and the frontiers of India, and, finally, the ultimate object of all imperial schemes and desires, Constantinople? For a long time now, Russian politicians, zealous proponents of the grandeur and glory of our dear empire, have been discussing whether it would not be better to transfer the empire's capital, and along with it the center of gravity of its forces, of its whole life, from the north to the south, from the bleak shores of the Baltic to the ever-verdant shores of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, in a word, from Petersburg to Constantinople. To be sure, there are patriots so insatiable as to want to keep Petersburg and supremacy on the Baltic and to seize Constantinople too. But this desire is so unattainable that even they are beginning to abandon any hope of fulfilling it, for all their faith in the omnipotence of the Russian Empire. Moreover, in recent years an event took place which must have been an eye-opener for them, the annexation of Holstein, Schleswig, and Hanover to the Kingdom of Prussia, which immediately thereby became a North Sea power. It is a well-known axiom that no state can be counted as a first-rank power unless it has an extensive sea coast guaranteeing it direct communications with the whole world and permitting it to take a direct part in the world's progress, social, political, and moral, as well as material. This truth is so obvious as to require no proof. Let us assume the strongest, best educated, and happiest state, to the extent that happiness is possible in a state, and imagine that circumstances have cut it off from the rest of the world. you can be certain that within 50 years or so, 2 generations, everything in it will come to a standstill, its strength will have been sapped, its educational level will verge on stupidity, and its happiness will give off the smell of Limburger cheese. Look at China. It seems to have been intelligent, learned, and probably, in its own way, happy too. Why did it become so decrepit that the most paltry efforts of the European maritime powers were sufficient to subject it to their intellect and, if not to their suzerainty, then at least to their wealth? Because for centuries China had stagnated, thanks in part to its domestic institutions but also to the fact that it was so remote from the current of world life that for a long time it had no contact with it. There are a number of different conditions that enable a nation shut up within a state to take part in world progress: native wit and innate energy, education, capacity for productive labor, and the broadest domestic freedom, impossible as the latter is for the masses within a state. But those conditions necessarily include seafaring and seaborne trade, for maritime communications, with their relative cheapness, speed, and freedom, in the sense that the seas do not belong to anyone, are superior to all others, including railroads. Perhaps aviation will someday prove even more convenient in every respect and will be particularly important in that it will finally equalize the conditions of existence and development in all countries. For now, however, it cannot be regarded as a serious alternative, and seafaring remains the principal method by which nations attain prosperity. The time will come when states will exist no more, and all the efforts of the Social Revolutionary Party in Europe are being bent to their destruction. The time will come when on the ruins of political states there will be created, in complete freedom and organized from below upwards, a voluntary fraternal union of voluntary productive associations, communes, and provincial federations, embracing without distinction, because they embrace freely, people of every language and nationality. Then all will have equal access to the sea, coastal dwellers directly, and those who live far from the sea via railroads free of all state supervisors, taxes, tariffs, restrictions, regulations, prohibitions, permissions, and applications. Even then, however, coastal inhabitants will have a number of natural advantages, not only of a material nature but intellectual and moral too. Direct contact with the world market and with the progress of world life in general is developing to an extraordinary degree, and however much relations may be equalized, inhabitants of the interior, deprived of those advantages, will live and develop at a slower and lazier pace than those on the coasts. That is why aviation will be so important. The atmosphere is a boundless ocean, its shores are everywhere, so that all individuals, even those living in most out-of-the-way places, are without exception coastal dwellers. Until aviation replaces seafaring, however, coastal inhabitants will be advanced in every respect and will constitute a kind of aristocracy of the human race. All history, and particularly the greater part of progress in history, has been made by coastal nations. The first nation, the creators of civilization, were the Greeks, and it can be said that the whole of Greece is nothing but a coastline. Ancient Rome became a mighty world stood only when it became a maritime state. In modern history, to whom do we owe the resurrection of political liberty, social life, commerce, the arts, science, free thought, in a word, the renaissance of humanity? To Italy, which, like Greece, is almost entirely a coastline. After Italy, who inherited the position of the leader of world progress, Holland, England, France, and finally America. On the other hand, let us take a look at Germany. Its people are endowed with many undeniable qualities, exceptional industry, a capacity for thought and science, an aesthetic sensibility which has produced great artists and poets, and a profound transcendentalism which has produced philosophers no less great. Why, we ask, did Germany lag so far behind France and England in all respects other than the one in which it outstripped everyone else, the development of a bureaucratic, police, and military state order? Why is it still inferior to Holland in trade, to Belgium in industry? Because, it will be said, Germany never had liberty, a love of liberty, a demand for liberty. That would be justified in part, but it is not the sole reason. Another, just as important, is the absence of a long coastline. Back in the 13th century, when the Hanseatic League originated, Germany had no lack of the seacoast. At least in the West, Holland and Belgium still belonged to it, and Germany's trade seemed to hold the promise of fairly extensive development. In the 14th century, however, the towns of the Low Countries, animated by a bold entrepreneurial spirit and a love of liberty, began manifestly to separate themselves from Germany and to become estranged from it. This separation was completed in the 16th century, and the great empire, the ungainly heir of the Roman Empire, became an almost entirely landlocked state. It retained only a narrow window on the sea between Holland and Denmark, far from sufficient to allow such a vast country to breathe freely. As a result, a somnolence very similar to China's stagnation descended upon Germany. From that time on, all progressive political development in Germany, in the sense of the formation of a strong new state, was concentrated in the small electorate of Brandenburg. In fact, the electors of Brandenburg, through their constant efforts to gain control of the shores of the Baltic, rendered Germany a great service. They can be said to have created the conditions for its greatness today, first seizing Königsberg and then, in the first partition of Poland, taking Danzig. But that was not enough. Kiel had to be seized, and all of Schleswig and Holstein as well. Prussia carried out these new conquests to the applause of all Germany. We all witnessed the passion with which Germans of every separate state Saarland, in the north, south, west, east, and center of the country, followed the development of the Schleswig-Holstein question after 1848. Those who accounted for this passion on the grounds of sympathy for their German blood brothers supposedly suffocating under Danish despotism were profoundly mistaken. An entirely different interest was involved here, a political interest, a pan-German interest, an interest in conquering seacoasts and maritime routes, an interest in creating a powerful German navy. The question of a German navy had already been raised in 1840 or 1841, and you recall the enthusiasm with which all Germany greeted her ex-ho in the German navy. 60. The Germans, we reiterate, are such a sediment of people that their passion for the state prevails over all their other passions and completely overwhelms their instinct for liberty. At the present time, however, it is also what constitutes their special greatness. It serves, and for some time will continue to serve, as a direct and unfailing source of support for all the ambitious designs of their Berlin sovereign. Prince Bismarck relies upon it greatly. The Germans are learned people, and they know that no great state can exist without maritime frontiers. That is why they persistently maintain, in defiance of historical, ethnographic, and geographical truth, that Schweiz was, is, and will be a German city, that the whole of the Danube is a German river. They strain toward the sea. And if social revolution does not stop them, one can rest assured that in 20 years, or 10, or maybe even less, events nowadays follow one another so quickly, in any case, in a short time they will conquer the whole of German Denmark, German Holland, and German Belgium. It lies within the natural logic, so to speak, of their political situation and their instinctive desires. They have already covered one stretch of this road. Prussia, the present-day embodiment of Germany, its head in its hands, has firmly established itself on the Baltic and on the North Sea. The autonomy of Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck, Mecklenburg, and Oldenburg is a hollow and harmless joke. Along with Holstein, Schleswig, and Hanover, they have all become part of Prussia, and Prussia, flush with French money, is building two strong navies, one on the Baltic and the other on the North Sea. Thanks to the shipping canal that is now being dug to connect the two seas, these two navies will soon be one. And before many years have passed, this navy, which already surpasses both the Danish and the Swedish, will become much stronger than the Russian Baltic fleet. Then, Russian hegemony on the Baltic will sink into the Baltic. Goodbye Riga, goodbye Revel, goodbye Finland, and goodbye Petersburg, with its impregnable Kronstadt. 61. To Archvox patriots, who will want to exaggerate Russia's power, this will seem nonsense, an evil fairy tale, but it is nothing other than an entirely accurate conclusion drawn from accomplished facts. It is based on a fair assessment of the character and capabilities of the Germans and the Russians, not to mention their financial resources and relative numbers of conscientious, dedicated, and knowledgeable officials of every sort, and not to mention scientific learning either, which gives all the Germans' undertakings a decided advantage over those of the Russians. German state service produces results that are unattractive, unpleasant, one might say loathsome, but nonetheless practical and serious. Russian state service produces results that are equally unpleasant and unattractive, but frequently even more primitive in form and at the same time futile. Let us take an example. Suppose the governments of Germany and Russia simultaneously appropriated a certain sum, say $1 million, to carry out some purpose, such as building a new ship. In Germany, do you think it would be stolen? Perhaps 100,000, maybe even 200,000, but at least 800,000 would go directly to the purpose at hand, which would be accomplished with all the efficiency and competence for which the Germans are noted. And in Russia? First of all, half of it would be embezzled, and a quarter of it would be wasted as a result of negligence and ignorance, so that at most the remaining quarter would be used to knock together something that was falling to pieces, good for show but unfit for its purpose. How, then, is the Russian Navy to resist the German Navy, and Russian coastal fortifications like Kronstadt to withstand bombardment by the Germans, who can fire not just iron but golden shells? Goodbye dominance on the Baltic. Goodbye the political significance and power of the northern capital that Peter the Great raised up on the Finnish swamp. If our great and venerable Chancellor, Prince Gorchakov, was still in possession of his faculties, he must have said that to himself when our ally Prussia, with impunity and, as it were, with our consent, was pillaging Denmark, which was no less our ally. He must have understood that Petersburg Russia's supremacy on the Baltic came to an end on the very day Prussia, relying now on the whole of Germany and constituting in indissoluble unity with it the strongest of the continental powers, in short, on the very day the new German Empire, formed under the scepter of Prussia, took up its present position on the Baltic, a position so menacing to all the other Baltic powers. Peter's great political creation had been destroyed, and along with it the very power of the Russian state, unless a new route were opened in the south to compensate for the loss of a free maritime route in the north. It is clear that the Germans will now come to hold sway on the Baltic. True, the entrance to it is still in the hands of Denmark. But who is blind to the fact that this poor little state has almost no other choice but first, perhaps, to become voluntarily federated with Germany, then to be fully swallowed up by pan-German state centralization. Hence the Baltic in a very short time will turn into an exclusively German sea, and Petersburg will necessarily lose all political significance. Gorchakov must have known this when he agreed to the dismemberment of the Kingdom of Denmark and the annexation of Holstein and Schleswig by Prussia. These events logically pose the following dilemma: either he betrayed Russia, or, in return for the Russian state's sacrifice of its supremacy in the northwest, he received a formal commitment from Bismarck to help Russia gain new power in the southeast. We have no doubt as to the existence of such a treaty, a defensive and defensive alliance concluded between Russia and Prussia almost immediately after the Peace of Paris, or at least at the time of the Polish insurrection in 1863, when almost all the European powers except Russia followed the example of France and England and publicly and officially protested against Russian barbarism. We have no doubt that Russia made a formal and mutually binding agreement, for such an alliance alone can explain the calm, one might say carefree, assurance with which Bismarck undertook the war against Austria and a large part of Germany despite the danger of French intervention, and then a still more decisive war against France. The least demonstration of hostility on Russia's part, such as a movement of Russian forces toward the Prussian frontier, would have been sufficient in both cases, and particularly the latter, to stop any further advance by the victorious Prussian army. Remember that at the end of last war the whole of Germany, and especially the northern part of it, was completely stripped of troops, that Austria's non-intervention on France's behalf had no other cause than Russia's declaration that if Austria moved its forces Russia would move its army against them, and that Italy and England failed to intervene only because Russia did not wish it. Had Russia not declared itself such a resolute ally of its Kurso, German Emperor. The Germans would never have taken Paris. Bismarck evidently was confident that Russia would not betray him. What were the grounds for that confidence? The family ties and personal friendship of the two emperors? Bismarck is too clever and experienced a man to count on sentiment in politics. Let us even suppose that our emperor, who, as everyone knows, is endowed with a sensitive heart and sheds tears very easily, might be carried away by such feelings, which he has more than once expressed at imperial drinking parties. He is surrounded by an entire government, a court, an heir to the throne who supposedly hates the Germans, and, finally, our venerable state patriot, Prince Gortsakov. All of them together, along with public opinion and the very force of circumstances, would remind them that states are guided not by feelings but by interests. Nor could Bismarck have counted on the identity of Russian and Prussian interests. There is no such identity, nor can there be. It exists only on one point, the Polish question. That question has long since been settled, however, and in all other respects nothing could be more contrary to the interests of the all-Russian state than the formation next door to it of a great and powerful all-German empire. The existence of two massive empires side by side entails war, which can have no other conclusion than the destruction of one or the other of them. War is unavoidable, but it can be postponed if the two empires realize that they have not adequately strengthened and stabilized themselves domestically to initiate a decisive encounter, a life and death struggle. Then, even though they hate one another, they continue to offer each other support and do each other good turns, each one hoping to make better use than the other of this involuntary alliance and to amass greater strength and resources for the inevitable future conflict. That is precisely the situation of both Russia and Prussian Germany. The German Empire has by no means consolidated its power either internally or externally. Internally, it is a peculiar conglomeration of many autonomous small and medium-sized states, which are doomed to extinction but have not yet been extinguished and seek to preserve at all costs the vestiges of their visibly dwindling autonomy. Externally, a humbled but not yet completely crushed Austria and a defeated and consequently irreconcilable France scale upon the new empire. Furthermore, the Neo-German Empire has not yet adequately rounded out its frontiers. Succumbing to a necessity intrinsic to military states, it plans new acquisitions, new wars, setting itself the objective of re-establishing the medieval German Empire within its primordial frontiers, and pan-German patriotism, which has seized the whole of German society, draws it inexorably toward that objective. It dreams of annexing all of Austria except Hungary, including Trieste but not Bohemia, all of German Switzerland, part of Belgium, and all of Holland and Denmark, which are essential for establishing its sea power. There are gigantic plans, the implementation of which will arouse a considerable part of Western and Southern Europe against it and is therefore categorically impossible without Russia's consent. Hence the Neo-German Empire still needs a Russian alliance. For its part, the Russian Empire cannot do without a Prusso-German alliance. Having renounced any expansion or new acquisitions in the northwest, it has to go southeastward. Having ceded supremacy on the Baltic to Prussia, it has to win and secure power on the Black Sea. Otherwise it will be cut off from Europe. For its dominion on the Black Sea to be real and useful, however, it must gain possession of Constantinople. Without it, not only can its access to the Mediterranean be blocked at any time, but entry into the Black Sea will always be open to hostile armies and navies, as was the case during the Crimean campaign. Hence the one objective for which the annexationist policy of our state is striving more than ever is Constantinople. The realization of this objective is contrary to the interests of all of Southern Europe, including, of course, France. It is contrary to England's interests and also to the interests of Germany, since Russia's unlimited sway over the Black Sea would make the banks of the Danube directly dependent on Russia. Nevertheless, it cannot be doubted that Prussia, forced to rely on a Russian alliance to carry out its plans of conquest in the West, formally obligated itself to aid Russia in its southeastern policy. Nor can it be doubted that it will take the first opportunity to betray its promise. Violation of the accord should not be expected just yet, when it has only begun to be carried out. We have seen how zealously the Prussian German Empire supported Russia over the issue of abrogating the constraints imposed by the Treaty of Paris, and there is no doubt that it is continuing to support Russia just as zealously over Khiva. Furthermore, it is to the Germans' advantage that the Russians withdraw as deeply as possible to the east. But what impelled the Russian government to undertake the campaign against Khiva? We cannot suppose that it was to defend the interests of Russian merchants and Russian commerce. If that were the case, one might ask why the government does not undertake similar campaigns inside Russia, against itself, against the Governor-General of Moscow, for example, and against all the provincial and town governors, who, as everyone knows, oppress and plunder both Russian commerce and Russian merchants in the most impudent manner and by every conceivable means. Of what use can it be to our state to conquer desert sands? Some, perhaps, are prepared to answer that our government undertook this campaign in order to fulfill Russia's great mission of bringing the West civilization to the East. This explanation may be suitable for academic or official speeches, or for doctrinaire books, pamphlets, and journals, which are always filled with elevated nonsense and always say the opposite of what is actually the case. It cannot satisfy us. Imagine the Petersburg government being guided in its undertakings and actions by its recognition of Russia's civilizing mission. The very idea is enough to make anyone who is the least bit familiar with the nature and motives of our rulers die laughing. Nor will we bother referring to the opening of new trade routes to India. Trade politics is England's politics, it has never been Russia's. The Russian state is primarily, one can say exclusively, a military state. It subordinates everything solely to the interests of coercive power. The sovereign, the state, that is what counts. Everything else, the people, even class interests, the flourishing of industry, trade, and so-called civilization, is but a means to the attainment of that one objective. Without a certain degree of civilization, without industry and trade, no state can exist, especially a modern one, because so-called national wealth, not the people's wealth, but the wealth of the privileged classes, is its strength. In Russia the state devours it all and, in turn, feeds a huge class of military, civil, and ecclesiastical officials. Universal graft, embezzlement of public funds and robbery of the people, that is the truest expression of the Russian state civilization. It is not surprising, therefore, that among other, more important reasons motivating the Russian government to undertake the campaign against Khiva, there were also so-called commercial reasons. New opportunities had to be opened up for the growing number of officials, among whom we count our merchants. They had to be given new provinces to lose. But no appreciable increase in the state's wealth and strength can be expected to result. On the contrary, one can be sure that financially the enterprise will produce much greater losses than profits. Why march to Khiva, then? To give the army something to do? For many decades the Caucasus served as a military school, but now the Caucasus has been pacified. A new school had to be opened, so the Khiva campaign was thought up. This explanation does not withstand criticism either, even if we assume appalling incompetence and stupidity on the part of the Russian government. The experience gained by our troops in the Khiva Desert is in no way applicable to a war against the West, and it is also too costly, so the advantages gained cannot compare with the losses and expense. Can the Russian government have thought seriously of conquering India? We are not guilty of excessive confidence in the wisdom of our Petersburg rulers, but we cannot believe that they set themselves such a preposterous objective. Conquer India. For whom, why, and how? It would require moving at least a quarter, if not half, of the Russian population to the east. And why conquer India anyway, which can be reached only by first subduing the numerous and warlike tribes of Afghanistan? Conquering Afghanistan, however, which is armed and in part trained by the English, would be at least 3 or 4 times harder than overcoming Khiva. If it is a matter of conquest, why not begin with China? China is very rich and in every respect more accessible to us than India, since there is nothing and nobody between China and Russia. Go take it, if you can. Indeed, by taking advantage of the disorders and civil wars which are the chronic malady of China, one could extend one's conquests very far into the country, and the Russian government seems to be venturing something along these lines. It is making manifest efforts to detach Mongolia and Manchuria. One fine day, perhaps, we will hear that Russian forces have crossed China's western frontier. It is an extremely risky business, reminding us very much of the famous victories of the ancient Romans over the Germanic peoples, victories which ended, of course, with the Roman Empire being sacked and conquered by the savage Germanic tribes. In China alone there are, by some estimates, 400 million inhabitants, by others 600 million, who evidently have become too crowded within the boundaries of the empire, and in an inexorable flow are emigrating on a mass scale, some to Australia, some across the Pacific to California. Others may ultimately move to the north and the northwest. And then, in the twinkling of an eye, Siberia, the whole region from the Tatar Strait to the Urals and the Caspian Sea, will cease to be Russian. Consider that this vast region, 12,220,000 square kilometers, which is more than 20 times the size of France, 528,600 square kilometers, contains no more than 6 million inhabitants, only about 2,600,000 of whom are Russians, while the rest are indigenous peoples of Tatar or Finnish origin, and a negligible number of troops. Will there be any possibility of stopping an invasion by the Chinese masses, who will not only inundate the whole of Siberia, including our new possessions in Central Asia, but will pour across the Urals right up to the Volga River? That is the danger all but inevitably facing us from the east. It is a mistake to scorn the Chinese masses. They are a threat by virtue of their numbers alone, because their inordinate increase makes their future existence within China's boundaries almost impossible. They are a threat also because they should not be judged by the Chinese merchants with whom the Europeans do business in Shanghai, Canton, or Mamukin 62 within China live masses much less debased by Chinese civilization, incomparably more energetic, certainly warlike, and habituated to military ways by their endless civil wars in which tens and hundreds of thousands of people perish. It should be noted too that of late they have begun to familiarize themselves with the use of modern weapons and with European training, the flower and last official word of Europe's state civilization. Combine that training, and that familiarity with new weapons and tactics, with the primitive barbarism of the Chinese masses, their lack of any conception of human protest or instinct for liberty, and with their habit of servile obedience, and they are now being combined, under the influence of the multitude of military adventurers, American and European, who flooded into China after the last Franco-English campaign in 1860. Take into consideration too, the monstrous size of the population, which has to find an outlet, and you will understand the magnitude of the danger threatening us from the east. That is the danger with which our Russian government is toying, naive as a child. It is impelled by the absurd desire to expand its frontiers, failing to take into account the fact that Russia is so sparsely populated, so poor, and so weak that to this day it has been unable, and always will be unable, to populate its newly acquired Amur region, which contains only 65,000 inhabitants, including the army and navy, in an area of 2,100,000 square kilometers, nearly 4 times the size of France. 0.63. Notwithstanding this impotence, notwithstanding the universal poverty of the Russian people, who have been reduced by their fatherlands government to such desperate straits that they have no other recourse or deliverance than the most destructive rebellion. Yes, notwithstanding these conditions, the Russian government hopes to establish its power over the whole Asiatic East. To proceed any further with even the slightest chance of success, it would not only have to turn its back on Europe and renounce any interference in European affairs, and Bismarck would like nothing better, it would have to move absolutely all of its military forces into Siberia and Central Asia and undertake the conquest of the East, like Tamerlane with his whole nation. Tamerlane's people followed him, however. The Russian people will not follow the Russian government. Let us turn again to India. However ridiculous the Russian government may be, it cannot entertain the hope of conquering India and consolidating its power over it. England conquered India initially with its trading companies. We have no such companies, or, if they exist at all, they are merely pocket-sized, for show. England conducts its massive exploitation of India, or its forced trade with it, by sea, by means of its great merchant and military fleets. We have no such fleets, and we are separated from India not by the sea but by endless desert, so there can be no talk of conquering India. If we cannot conquer it, however, we can destroy or at least seriously weaken England's dominion over it by stirring up and assisting native rebellions, even supporting them, when necessary, with military intervention. Yes, we can, though with enormous losses of men and money, and we are not rich in either one. Why would we bear these losses, however? For no other purpose than to give ourselves the naive satisfaction of playing dirty tricks on the English with no benefit to ourselves, and, in fact, to our actual detriment? No, it is because the English obstruct us. And where do they obstruct us? In Constantinople. As long as England maintains its power, it will never, not for anything in the world, allow Constantinople to become in our hands the new capital either of the Russian Empire or the Slavic or Eastern Empire. That is why the Russian government undertook the war in Khiva, and why from time immemorial it has sought to draw closer to India. It seeks the point at which it can do harm to England, and finding no other it threatens India. It hopes in this way to make the English accept the idea that Constantinople must become a Russian city, to compel them to consent to this conquest, which more than ever is a necessity for statist Russia. Russia's supremacy on the Baltic is irretrievably lost. To contend with the awesome and magnificently organized power of the newly risen German Empire is beyond the capacity of the Russian state, unified by bayonet and knout, hated by all the nations imprisoned and enchained within it, starting with the great Russians, demoralized, disorganized, and despoiled by its native despotism, native stupidity, and native thievery. And it is beyond its military strength, which exists more on paper than in reality and is of use only against the unarmed, and even then only so long as we lack resoluteness. Therefore it must give up the Baltic and await the moment when the entire Baltic region becomes a German province. Only a popular revolution can prevent it. But for the state such a revolution means death, and our government will not seek its salvation there. No other salvation remains to it than alliance with Germany. Forced to give up the Baltic to the Germans, the Russian state must now seek a new arena on the Black Sea, a new basis for its grandeur and simply for its political existence and significance. It cannot obtain it, however, without the permission and assistance of the Germans. The Germans have promised their assistance. Indeed, we are certain that Bismarck and Gorbachev concluded a formal treaty in which the Germans obligated themselves to render that assistance to the Russian state, but they never will, of that we are equally certain. They will not do so because they can never subject the banks of the Danube and their Danube trade to Russia's whim. Also, because it cannot be in their interest to foster an increase in Russian power, the rise of the great Pan-Slav Empire in the south of Europe. That would simply be a form of suicide by the Pan-German Empire. But to nudge Russian troops into Central Asia, toward Khiva, under the pretext that this is the most direct route to Constantinople, that is something else again. It seems to us beyond doubt that our venerable state patriot and diplomat, Prince Gorbachev, and his imperial patron Alexander II played an extremely stupid role in this deplorable affair, and that the celebrated German patriot and state swindler, Prince Bismarck, duped them even more adroitly than he duped Napoleon III. The deed is done, however, and it cannot be undone. A new German empire has arisen, majestic and menacing, laughing both at its invaders and its enemies. It will not be brought down by Russia's flabby forces, that can be accomplished only by revolution. Until revolution triumphs in Russia or in Europe, statist Germany will triumph and will hold sway over all, and the Russian state, like the other continental states of Europe, will exist only by its need and by its grace. That, it goes without saying, sorely grieves the heart of every Russian state patriot, but a threatening fact is a fact nonetheless. The Germans more than ever have become our masters, and it is no wonder that all the Germans in Russia so noisily and enthusiastically celebrated the victory of the German army and friends. No wonder that all the Petersburg Germans so jubilantly welcomed their new Pan-German emperor as the symbol of liberty in the French Revolution. We have heard from Mazzini himself that at this very time official Russian agents in London asked to meet with him and make proposals to him. C. It was actually Frederick William IV, who had been known familiarly as Fritz. D. The text reads without unstable, Neperknik, maritime frontiers. I have omitted the word unstable, which makes no sense here. 4. Today there is only one truly sovereign state left on the entire continent of Europe, and that is Germany. Indeed, of all the continental powers, we are referring, of course, only to the great powers, since it is obvious that the small and medium-sized states are inescapably doomed first to utter dependence, and then, after a short time, to extinction. Of all the first-ranked states, the German Empire alone fulfills all the conditions of complete independence, while the others are reduced to dependence on it. That is not only because it won brilliant victories in recent years over Denmark, Austria, and France, because it seized all of the latter's arms and military supplies and forced it to pay 5 billion francs. And because with the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine it assumed a superb military position, defensive as well as offensive, vis-a-vis France. It is not only because the German army now unquestionably surpasses all the armies of Europe in numbers, weaponry, discipline, organization, and the efficiency and military knowledge not only of its officers but of its non-commissioned officers and soldiers, not to mention the undeniable superiority of its general staff. It is not only because the mass of the German population consists of literate, industrious, productive, and relatively well-educated, not to say learned, individuals, who are also submissive and obedient to the authorities and the law. Nor is it only because the German administration and bureaucracy have all but realized the ideal which the administration and bureaucracy of every other state strive in vain to achieve. All these advantages, of course, have furthered and are furthering the astounding success of the new pan-German state, but they are not the main cause of its current overwhelming power. It may even be said that they are themselves nothing more than effects of a deeper and more general cause lying at the basis of all of German social life. That is, the social instinct which forms the characteristic trait of the German people. This instinct consists of two elements, seemingly antithetical but always inseparable: a servile instinct for obedience at any price, or docile and prudent submission to superior force under the pretext of obedience to so-called legitimate authority, and at the same time a domineering instinct for systematic subjugation of anything that is weaker, an instinct for command, conquest, and systematic oppression. Both of these instincts have attained a considerable degree of development in almost every German, except, of course, for the proletariat, whose circumstances preclude the possibility of satisfying at least the second of the two. Always inseparable, complementing and explaining each other, both lie at the very basis of patriotic German society. The entire history of Germany attests to the classic obedience of Germans of every class and rank to the authorities, especially modern German history, which is an uninterrupted series of feats of submissiveness and patience. A veritable cult of state power developed in the German heart over the centuries, a cult which gradually created a bureaucratic theory and practice. Thanks to the efforts of German scholars, it subsequently formed the basis of all the political science now taught in the universities of Germany. History likewise attests forcefully to the aggressive and tyrannical aspirations of the German nation, from the German crusader knights and barons of the Middle Ages to the last Philistine burgher of modern times. No one has experienced those aspirations as bitterly as the Slavs. It may be said that the entire historical mission of the Germans, at least in the north and the east, and, of course, as the Germans themselves understand it, consisted, and still does, by and large, of exterminating, enslaving, and forcibly Germanizing the Slavs. It is a long, sad story, the memory of which is preserved deep in the hearts of the Slavs and will without doubt take its toll in the final, inevitable struggle of the Slavs against the Germans, unless social revolution reconciles them first. For an accurate assessment of the aggressive aspirations of German society as a whole, a brief glance at the development of German patriotism since 1815 will suffice. From 1525, the time of the bloody suppression of the Peasant Rebellion, to the literary renaissance of the second half of the 18th century, Germany remained sunk in a deep sleep, interrupted at times by cannon fire and terrible scenes and experiences of merciless war, of which it was for the most part both theater and victim. At such times it would wake up and fight but would soon go back to sleep again, lulled by Lutheran sermons. In this period of almost 2.5 centuries, under the influence of those sermons, its obedience and servile patience developed to the utmost, attaining virtually heroic proportions. A system of unconditional obedience to and blessing of authority formed. At this time and was absorbed into the entire life, flesh, and blood of every German. A science of administration and a pedantically systematic, inhuman, and impersonal bureaucratic practice developed along with it. Every German official became a priest of the state, prepared to sacrifice his most beloved son on the altar of state service, not with a knife but with a clerk's pen. At the same time the German nobility, incapable of anything other than military activity and servile intrigue, was offering its mercenary sword and its unscrupulous services as courtiers and diplomats to better paying European courts. The German burgher, obedient unto death, endured, toiled, paid heavy taxes without complaint, lived in squalid and cramped conditions, and consoled himself with the idea of the immortality of the soul. The power of the countless princes who divided up Germany among themselves was unlimited. Professors slapped each other as faces and then denounced each other to the authorities. The students, dividing their time between dead knowledge and beer, were fully deserving of them. As far as the laboring people were concerned, nobody spoke of them or gave them a thought. That was still Germany's situation in the second half of the 18th century, when suddenly, by some miracle, from this bottomless abyss of vileness and vulgarity, a magnificent literature rose, created by Lessing and culminating in Goethe, Schiller, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. As is well known, this literature took shape at first under the direct influence of the great French literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, first the classical and then the philosophical literature. From the very start, however, in the works of its progenitor, Lessing, it took on a fully independent character, content, and born, drawn, it may be said, from the very depths of German contemplative life. In our opinion, this literature constitutes the greatest, and virtually the only, service of modern Germany. With its boldness and its broad scope it significantly advanced the human intellect and opened new horizons to thought. Its principal merit consists of the fact that while on the one hand it was a thoroughly national literature, at the same time it was to the highest degree humanistic and universal, which is the characteristic feature of all, or nearly all, of the European literature of the 18th century. But whereas French literature, for example in the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot and the other encyclopedists, strove to transpose all human problems from the realm of theory to practice, German literature chastely and rigorously preserved its theoretical and largely pantheistic character. It was the literature of an abstractly poetic and metaphysical humanism, from the heights of which its devotees looked upon real life with scorn, a scorn fully merited, however, since everyday German life was vulgar and repellent. Thus German life was divided into two opposed spheres, which negated but also complemented each other. One was a world of broad and lofty but wholly abstract humanism. The other a world of historically inherited submissive vileness and vulgarity. The French Revolution found Germany in this bifurcated condition. As we know, the revolution was welcomed with great approval and, it may be said, with real sympathy by almost the whole of literary Germany. Goethe frowned a bit and grumbled that the noise of those unprecedented events was disturbing him and breaking the thread of his learned and artistic pursuits and poetic meditations. The majority of the representatives and adherents of the latest literature, metaphysics, and science, however, greeted the revolution with joy, in the expectation that it would realize all their ideals. Freemasonry, which still played a very serious role at the end of the 18th century and united progressive individuals of all the countries of Europe in an invisible but quite real brotherhood, formed a vital bond between the French revolutionaries and the noble dreamers of Germany. When the Republican forces, having heroically rebuffed Brunswick 64 and put him to disgraceful fight, first crossed the Rhine, they were met by the Germans as deliverers. Their sympathetic attitude toward the French did not last long. The French soldiers, as was befitting of Frenchmen, were of course very polite, and as Republicans were deserving of every sympathy, but they were soldiers all the same, that is, unceremonious representatives and servants of force. The presence of such liberators soon became onerous for the Germans, and their enthusiasm cooled considerably. The revolution itself, moreover, assumed such an energetic character that it could no longer be reconciled in any way with the abstract ideas and the Philistine and contemplative temperament of the Germans. Heinz 65 relates that in the end, in the whole of Germany only the Königsberg philosopher Kant retained a sympathy for the French Revolution, despite the September massacres, the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre's Terror 66. Then the Republic was replaced, first by the Directory, then by the Consulate, and finally by the Empire. The Republican Army became a blind and for a long time victorious instrument of Napoleon's ambition, which was colossal to the point of madness, and at the end of 1806, after the Battle of Jena, Germany was completely inflamed. Its new life began in 1807. Who does not know the amazing story of the rapid rebirth of the Kingdom of Prussia, and through it of the whole of Germany? In 1806 the state power created by Frederick the Great and his father and grandfather lay completely in ruins. The army, which had been organized and trained by the great commander, had been destroyed. All of Germany and all of Prussia, except for the outlying territory of Königsberg, had been subjugated by French troops and was actually governed by French prefects, while the political existence of the Kingdom of Prussia had been spared only thanks to the entreaties of Alexander I, the Emperor of Russia. In this critical situation a group of people, ardent Prussian or, even more, German patriots, came forward. Intelligent, bold, and resolute, having learned the lessons and profited by the example of the French Revolution, they conceived the idea of saving Prussia and Germany by means of broad liberal reforms. At another time, before the Battle of Jena, for instance, or perhaps after 1815, when noble and bureaucratic reaction came into its own once again, they would not have dared even to think about such reforms. The court and military party would have crushed them, and their very virtuous and very stupid King Frederick William III, who knew nothing except his unlimited divine right, would have locked them up in Spandau prison as soon as they had uttered one word on the subject. In 1807, however, the situation was entirely different. The military, bureaucratic, and aristocratic party had been destroyed, put to shame and humiliated to such a degree that it had lost its voice, while the king had received a lesson that could have made even a fool wise, at least for a short time. Bernstein 67 became prime minister and with a bold hand began to break up the old order and build a new one in Prussia. His first task was to emancipate the peasants from serfdom, with not only the right but the real possibility of acquiring land as personal property. His second task was to abolish the privileges of the nobility and to make all estates equal before the law in respect to military and civil service. His third task was to create a provincial and municipal administration on an elective basis. But his principal task was to reform the army completely, or, rather, to turn the whole Prussian nation into an army, divided into three categories: the active army, the Landwehr, and the Sturmwehr. Finally, Stein gave broad